Every town in Red Dead Redemption 2 is dying in slow motion. From the muddy streets of Valentine to the choking smoke of Annisburg, from the rotting piers of Van Horn to the cholera-stricken dust of Armadillo, the entire map is a story of a civilization writing its own obituary and pretending it is progress. Each settlement is a chapter in that obituary, a different verse in the same funeral hymn. Valentine, with its saloons and cattle auctions, clings to the dream of open-range freedom even as the railroad carves steel lines through its fields. Rhodes drowns in old blood and new money, trapped between plantation ghosts and corporate futures. St. Denis towers over them all as the living embodiment of industry and empire, its gas lamps and factories shining over sewers full of the people that progress has decided are expendable. From its humble beginnings in frontier camps and river landings in the 1870s, this world grows into something harsher and more ordered. The promise is freedom, opportunity, civilization. The reality is railroads, oil derricks, mining companies, and sugar barons grinding land and bodies into profit. The wilderness stands on one side, wild and indifferent. Industry rises on the other, disciplined and ruthless. Between them, town by town, the old ways were dying. Into this landscape rides the Van der Linde gang, not just as outlaws passing through, but as a moving mirror held up to every place they touch. In Valentine, their philosophy of rough freedom and found family feels almost natural, drunk on mud, horses, and easy money. In Rhodes, their idealistic talk about justice becomes entangled with old aristocratic hatred, and the gang is used as a weapon by families who see human lives as property. In St. Denis, Dutch's speeches about liberty dissolve in the glow of electric lights and bank vault doors, exposed as delusions in the face of real power. Annisburg breathes coal dust and despair, showing what happens when a town's only value is the coal beneath its feet. Van Horn survives on wreckage and ruin, a harbor for every lost soul the new order has spat out. Blackwater, gleaming and modern, is the future that has no place for men who rob ferries and dream about living off the land. Even far to the west, Armadillo and Tumbleweed tell the same story in reverse. Towns that boomed too fast, burned too hot, and were left to rot by the very forces that created them. This is not just a tour of locations. It is, in the truest sense, the complete intertwined history of every major town, traced from their founding myths in the 1870s, through the gang's doomed campaign in 1899, to the faded echoes of 1907 and 1911, when some remember the outlaws as legends, and others erase them from the record. What happens when a world built on conquest runs out of frontier? What happens to dreams when civilization arrives with ledgers, courts, and machine guns? To answer that, the story begins with the first towns that tried to tame the wilderness, and the first men who believed they could stay free inside their shadow. To understand that shadow, the camera has to pull in closer, not just on Dutch or Arthur or John, but on the places that made their dreams feel possible and their delusions feel inevitable. This is The Promise, a story of every settlement, every secret, one long ride across a world that is already dying while its towns pretend to be thriving. From its humble beginnings in the muddy cattle streets of Valentine to the neon glow of St. Denis and the ghostly emptiness of Armadillo, each town will be taken apart piece by piece. Origin, economy, politics, hidden lore. How did this place begin? Who owns it now? Who suffers in silence beneath it? And what remains of it when the gang is gone? A saloon brawl, a bank job, a whispered rumor on a porch at midnight, all are clues in a larger autopsy of a civilization that calls itself progress. This is the entire lore approach, but turned outward, not focused on a single outlaw, but on geography itself, on the land and the lines carved across it by railroads, rivers, and industry. The rail line that brings cattle to Valentine also brings Pinkertons. The plantations around Rhodes feed the wealth of the Greys and Braithwaites while choking the town in old hatreds. The mines of Annisburg grind families into coal dust so that St. Denis can glow brighter at night. In the truest sense, the gang moves through the living embodiment of the very forces that will destroy it. The structure of this journey mirrors the gang's own path. The story begins with the first towns they truly touch in 1899 and moves roughly in the order those hoofbeats fall. From Valentine to Rhodes, from the swamps outside St. Denis to the broken docks of Van Horn and the smoke-choked cliffs of Annisburg. But time in this world is not a straight road. The ride will jump forward to 1907 and even to 1911, returning to Blackwater, to Tumbleweed, to Armadillo, to see what rots, what grows, and what simply disappears from the map. Along the way, specific answers wait. St. Denis will be traced back to its real inspirations in turn-of-the-century New Orleans, with segregated streetcars, corrupt mayors, and a criminal aristocracy in men like Angelo Bronte. Roads will be tied to post, Civil War plantation towns where the old ways were dying but refused to admit it. The buried history of the Blackwater massacre will be reconstructed from rumors, newspapers, and the quiet terror of townsfolk who never say quite enough. Armadillo's slow death by cholera will be followed from the first warning posters to the final, haunted silence of its main street. Newspapers, overheard conversations, discarded letters, even the way a sheriff's office changes between games, all tell a second, darker story beneath the missions. Who profits when a town prospers? Who vanishes when a railroad arrives? Who remembers an outlaw, and who pretends he never existed? This is a story of freedom promised and freedom denied, of loyalty to towns that never loved their own. To see that clearly, the map has to shrink down to a single dirt street. The tale of these towns begins, as the gangs does, in the heart of cattle country, in a place that seems almost harmless at first glance. A few ranch hands, a busy rail platform, a saloon where two men might accidentally try to rob each other at the same time. Valentine, noisy and unassuming, waits at the edge of the snow, ready to show how a friendly frontier town talks when it thinks no one is really listening. Valentine introduces itself with noise and mud. The first real town after the blizzard is not a shining symbol of civilization, but a long, churned-up main street where wagon ruts have become trenches and every passing hoof throws another layer of filth onto wooden walkways. On one side, cattle pens press against the road, restless animals bellowing beneath hanging hides and rough-hewn fences. On the other, the saloon doors never quite stop swinging. From its humble beginnings as a rail stop and cattle platform, Valentine has grown outward in crooked lines rather than grand designs. The hotel leans over the street with peeling paint and thin walls. The general store sits cramped beside it, and the livestock auction yard sprawls at the edge of town, where fortunes rise and fall with the swing of a gate. Above it all, the railroad slices straight through the middle, iron tracks and telegraph poles declaring, in the truest sense, that this place belongs to a larger world now. Valentine is not wilderness. It is not yet true city. It is the living embodiment of an in-between age. Its economy tells the same story. This is a classic cattle town, a story of animals turned into numbers, and numbers turned into tickets east. Ranchers drive herds in from the heartlands, drovers sleep in crowded bunks, and railroad men time everything to the minute so that beef, hides, and bone can be loaded and gone before the next train whistles through. Around that brutal efficiency orbit the saloon, the doctor, the gunsmith, and the general store, all feeding on the same current of money and exhaustion. Where there is cash, there are card games. Where there is liquor, there are grudges. Is it any wonder an outlaw family drifting down from the mountains feels right at home? On the surface, the town's social layers look simple. Ranch hands and cowboys stomp through the mud, laughing too loud and fighting too quick. Small business owners stand on their porches, trying to keep some semblance of order with polite greetings and firm credit policies. The sheriff and his deputies, underpaid and overworked, move through it all with a wary eye. Knowing they cannot control everything, only respond. Above them, unseen but ever present, sit the wealthier ranch interests and rail companies, men whose profits grow with every shipment, who tolerate chaos on the street as long as the trains keep running on time. Then the Van der Linde gang arrives, and Valentine's balance is quietly shattered. A drunken bar fight with Bill turns the saloon into a wrestling pit, bodies crashing through tables as onlookers cheer and then recoil. Debt collections with Strauss's ledgers drag Arthur into back rooms and lonely farms, where the town's smiling storefronts give way to sick families and desperate borrowers. When the bank is finally robbed, that mud-soaked Main Street becomes a killing ground, smoke and gunfire tearing through what once felt almost harmless. After each of these shocks, Valentine changes. Wanted posters multiply on the sheriff's wall. New guards appear on the platforms. NPC conversations shift from idle gossip about prices and weather to fearful talk of gangs in the hills and trains being hit along the line. The town learns to fear riders who do not belong, to read scruffy coats and tired horses as warnings. Even those who profit from the rail and the cattle begin to tighten their grip, because the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. Telegraph wires hum above the mud, trains run on stricter schedules, and every report sent east makes it harder for an outlaw to disappear. Valentine shows, from the very beginning, that even the most traditional frontier town is already hardening, already choosing civilization over freedom, setting a pattern that every other settlement the gang touches will follow, in blood and in silence. The next town down the line will not be so forgiving. The next town down the line will not be so forgiving. But Valentine is where the quiet corrosion first becomes impossible to ignore. On the surface, it is mud, horses, and hard liquor. Underneath, it is ledgers, warrants, and bruised faces, all pulling in different directions as the world was changing faster than the town can follow. Nothing embodies that tension more than the bank. A squat brick box on the main drag, it stands apart from the warped wood and peeling paint, a little readout of Eastern capital dropped into the frontier. Its iron bars and polished counters promise stability, yet its very presence is a story of money arriving long before the culture around it is ready. Ranchers deposit cattle profits, railroad men wire funds east, and in the middle of it all, Dutch's gang walks in and treats this temple of civilization as just another stagecoach on legs. The Valentine robbery is small compared to St. Denis, but thematically it is the very beginning of the gang's war with the financial order. Dutch talks about robbing the rich and corrupt. The bank is his perfect symbol. To the clerks, this is progress. To the outlaws, it is a target. In the truest sense, the building is neutral brick and mortar, yet every dollar inside it represents a choice about who gets to own the future. Across the street, the sheriff's office shows the other half of that equation. The law in Valentine is reactive, not commanding. Wanted posters curl on the walls, deputies come and go, and the sheriff's authority hangs less on force than on the hope that distant Pinkertons and federal pressure will keep the worst wolves at bay. When trouble erupts, he deputizes whoever can hold a rifle. Order is not imposed, it is begged for. This fragility is clearest in the bar. The legendary fight with Tommy is more than a bit of slapstick brutality. It is the living embodiment of how Valentine measures status. Men trade punches as easily as they trade drinks, and a broken nose can be worth more than a full wallet. Debt collections for Strauss turn that same culture into a business model, as Arthur rides out to shake down farmers already drowning in loans from the very bank he just robbed. Violence becomes a currency, flowing alongside dollars and IOUs, and every brawl in the mud reinforces who can be pushed and who must be feared. Listen closely in the streets, and that strain is everywhere. Ranch hands mutter about grazing rights and undercut cattle prices. Newspapers mention distant markets, small scandals, and quiet foreclosures that never make it into cutscenes. A drunk complains that the railroad is fixing rates. A shopkeeper grumbles about credit. From its humble beginnings as a stopping point on the line, Valentine is already bending under pressures it cannot name, caught between the old ways we're dying and a new order that only speaks in interest and law. After the gang's hits, the town does not collapse. It flinches. More guards watch the bank doors, the sheriff eyes every stranger. And talk of those outlaws up in the hills spreads through saloons and supper tables. The frontier's indulgence for men like Dutch and Arthur is thinning, and Valentine's nervous glances foreshadow a harsher reality down the tracks. Because if this muddy little way station is starting to armor itself, what waits in a place built entirely on blood and money? What waits, at first glance, looks harmless. After the mud, manure, and nervous glances of Valentine, Strawberry appears almost unreal, a painted postcard tucked into the pines. Wooden bridges cross clear, fast streams, mist hangs over tall evergreens, neat wooden facades line a main street that seems built for strolling rather than stampedes. It feels less like an outlaw playground and more like a mountain resort, a place where civilization has come to breathe clean air. That illusion is the point. From its humble beginnings as a logging settlement, Strawberry has been remade in the image of one man, Mayor Nicholas Timmons. Where Valentine is shaped by cattle and railroads, Strawberry is shaped by ego. Timmons is a self-styled reformer, a man who talks about progress, culture, and modernity, while making sure his name is carved into every plank and plaque. New bridges? His idea. Fresh paint on the storefronts? His directive. Tourist brochures and talk of visitors from the East? His favorite subject. On the surface, his philosophy is simple. turn a backwoods camp into a destination. The town's economy still leans on logging and the hard work of men in the surrounding forests. But Timmins pushes a second pillar, small-scale tourism and civic vanity projects. A nicer hotel, a theater, promenades along the water, Strawberry becomes the living embodiment of a frontier town trying to impress strangers. Yet, in the truest sense, the real engine of his ambitions is less picturesque: prisoners, work crews, and the quiet monetization of punishment. Behind the tidy streets sits a jail that never feels entirely full, yet always seems busy. Chain gangs clear brush, hammer boards, expand paths that conveniently align with the mayor's grand plans. Lawbreakers become cheap labor, and cheap labor becomes civic improvement. It is a story of order and profit, of justice and convenience, of a man who talks about community while treating human beings as tools. The world was changing, and Strawberry shows how the new order can hide its cruelty behind fresh varnish. Into this curated little paradise rides a problem Timmins cannot manage with paint: the Vanderlinde gang. When Micah is locked in Strawberry's jail after his bloody outburst in the saloon, the clash is more than personal. Dutch's romantic outlaw myth, freedom on horseback, loyalty against a corrupt civilization, slams headfirst into a bureaucratic, image-conscious power that cares less about right and wrong and more about headlines and appearances. An escaped killer is, to Timmins, not just a threat, but a stain on his brochure. Arthur's brutal jailbreak of Micah tears through the fade. Gunfire shatters windows, corpses litter those carefully swept walkways, and the mayor's proud little showpiece is exposed as fragile, reactive, desperate. Yet even this chaos becomes useful. Outlaws give men like Timmins excuses: more lawmen, harsher sentences, broader authority, all in the name of protecting that postcard dream. The old ways were dying, but not always under smokestacks and factory whistles. Sometimes they were strangled by a smile, a sash, and a promise of progress. Strawberry stands as an early warning. The next West will not always look like Saint Denis. Sometimes it will look beautiful, speak softly, and turn every lost soul, every criminal, every drifter into raw material for control. Strawberry promises a gentler future, but the gang's real future sits to the south, across an invisible border drawn in blood. That border has a name whispered more than spoken: Blackwater. From the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2, Blackwater is present without being accessible. It sits on the map, fully drawn, its shoreline and streets visible, but ringed with invisible guns. Ride too close, and the illusion of freedom shatters. Bounties spike instantly, lawmen materialize on ridgelines. Pinkertons ride out in disciplined formations. This is not a town to be explored, it is a crime scene the gang is not allowed to leave. The reason is the ferry. The reason is the massacre. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, has already burned through Blackwater before the player ever sets foot in the world. Dutch's grand plan to rob a boat heavy with cash ends and civilian bodies floating in the harbor, dead lawmen on the docks, and gang members left behind or buried in unmarked graves. The details are deliberately fractured: a half-finished sentence at the campfire, a newspaper hinting at bandits and tragic loss of life, a Pinkerton agent promising that the truth will never see daylight. Blackwater itself does not pause to mourn. It is the living embodiment of the New West: paved streets instead of mud, electric lights instead of lanterns, steamboats instead of skiffs pulled by hand. Its economy runs on shipping and capital, on telegraph lines and rail connections that bind it to a larger, unseen world. Dutch claims to despise this civilization, this polished cage where freedom is measured in bank accounts and court rulings, yet this is exactly the place he tried to rob in order to fund his own idealistic escape. The irony is brutal. The gang is pushed into the snow of Coulter and the pines around Strawberry, while Blackwater carries on, its windows glowing warm over water that once ran red. In the truest sense, the town becomes a ghost story that refuses to recognize its own ghosts. Official reports sanitize the event, respectable citizens keep trading and dining, and the massacre is folded into a narrative of order restored. The old ways were dying, but the method of killing them is carefully hidden under concrete, gaslight, and polite conversation. Here, the contrast is everything. Strawberry feels curated, a frontier resort selling a fantasy of nature. Blackwater feels finished, a port city confident that history bends toward its kind of progress. One is a stage, The other is the engine room of modern America. Yet both are built on the same thing: violence turned invisible, blood paved over until it becomes an address and a tax base. For the van der Linde gang, Blackwater is not just a place on the map, it is the wound that never closes. It defines their present, forcing them east into more desperate territory, into Rhodes and St. Denis and the long slide toward Beaver Hollow. But how does the world remember that ferry, those bodies, that failed philosophy? And, years later, when Blackwater stands taller than ever, who will even remember the lost soul who pulled the trigger on that boat? That answer waits in the future, in another game, in another dying town. That future belongs to Blackwater and John Marston. The present belongs to a different place, a different wound in the land. East of the massacre on the water, past the swamps and the hanging moss, lies Rhodes, a town that never quite left the last war it fought. From its humble beginnings as a crossroads for planters and traders, Rhodes grew into a neat little grid of false calm. A dusty main street, a whitewashed sheriff's office, a modest saloon, a general store with peeling paint, all framed by faded Confederate flags and sun-bleached memorials to a cause already lost. Step off that street for a moment and the illusion breaks. On every horizon, the real power rises in long rows of cotton and tobacco, in the columns and verandas of the Braithwaite and Gray plantations. Rhodes is, in the truest sense, a company town without a company. The Braithwaites at Braithwaite Manor and the Grays at Caliga Hall are the living embodiment of old Southern aristocracy, clinging to honor and family pride while their fortunes rot. Their money built the brickwork, their hired guns lean on storefront railings, their names decide who sits in office and who rots in the jail. The sheriff smiles and plays at law, but his badge is effectively stamped with two surnames. Even the train platform and the flow of goods through town bend around their invisible line in the dirt. Beneath that genteel surface sits an economy that never truly changed. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but Rhodes still runs on cotton bales, tobacco crates, and the ghosts of slave labor reborn as sharecropping and tenant farming. Freed black residents walk the streets under watchful eyes, pushed to the margins of town, barred from certain porches and seating, spoken to with a venom the game rarely names but constantly shows. Segregated benches, sneered remarks, and nervous glances at armed white men tell a story of freedom promised and then quietly revoked. Into this fragile balance rides the van der Linde gang, desperate, bruised from Blackwater, and ready to turn someone else's ruin into their salvation. Their infiltration of Rhodes is clever, almost elegant, posing as cousins, laborers, hired hands. They slip into both households, running errands for the Grays while courting the Braithwaites, letting each family believe it has found a new ally. Two dynasties that have spent decades bleeding each other dry suddenly fight over the loyalty of professional liars. On paper, it is a perfect con. In practice, it is a moral low point. The gang toys with a community already shredded by history, stoking paranoia and betrayal for a payout that can never match the damage. What does it mean when outlaws who claim a philosophy of freedom choose to become the sharp edge of a dying aristocracy? Rhodes becomes a story of old power structures refusing to die, of dreams and delusions clinging to crumbling porches while gunmen gather in the shade. Every favor done, every secret carried between Braithwaite Manor and Caliga Hall tightens a noose around the town's neck. The explosion is coming, in the fields, on the street, at a quiet party turned battlefield, and when it hits. Rhodes will show what happens when a lost soul of a town is forced to pick a side in a war it already lost. Beyond Rhodes, the road leads to a different vision of civilization, St. Denis, where the same rot hides behind electric lights and grand avenues. Rhodes does not explode all at once. It frays, thread by thread, as the van der Linde gang turns a simmering feud into open war. And the polite fiction of order gives way to what was hiding there from the very beginning. It starts with a performance. The stagecoach robberies with the Grays are, in the truest sense, theater, outlaws pretending to be lawmen pretending to be victims, and the plantation heirs pretending they still control the world around them. Arthur and the others ride out in gray uniforms, protecting Rhodes they plan to rob. A story of loyalty and betrayal played out in broad daylight. The town watches, half believing, half afraid to ask questions. Who really owns the roads into Rhodes? Power answers before the sheriff ever can. From its humble beginnings as a crooked protection racket, the work escalates. The gang becomes hired guns for both families, running errands that feel small but carry the weight of generations, intimidating debtors, escorting fragile egos, standing guard at parties where every smile hides a grudge. The plantation houses rise over the bayou as the living embodiment of an old philosophy, insisting that the old ways were dying only because the wrong people had money now. Each mission ties Rhodes tighter to the feud until the disastrous Braithwaite Manor raid rips the fade apart. The sheriff sits at the center of this, both complicit and powerless. Sheriff Gray chats amiably with Arthur on the porch, jokes about order, and then quietly admits that nothing in Rhodes moves without Braithwaite or Gray approval. Law here serves the planter families first, the town second, and justice not at all. When the gang guns down Braithwaite men in the streets, when the saloon becomes a killing floor, the badge does nothing. What is law in a place where a family name carries more weight than any statute? Then the feud stops being a game. Jack Marston's kidnapping shatters Dutch's idealistic talk of honor among outlaws. The genteel veneer of southern civility collapses as the gang storms Braithwaite Manor, torches licking at white columns. Gunfire echoing through manicured gardens. Catherine Braithwaite crawling toward the lake, screaming curses as her world burns, is Rhodes in miniature, a grand house of lies collapsing into ash. By dawn, the town is leaderless, its dynasties broken, its sheriff exposed as a man who could not protect even the illusion of order. Yet the deepest scars are not just on mansions and men with titles. In the background, Rhodes has always been marked by racial terror. A tree on the edge of town bearing the remnants of a lynching, segregated benches and rail platforms, whispered conversations among black residents who flinch when Braithwaite riders pass. Their fear tells a parallel story of dreams crushed before they could form. The feud is a white elite family argument, but its costs fall hardest on those who never had the freedom to choose a side. After the fires, Rhodes does not heal, it merely goes quiet. The streets feel wider, emptier. The saloon has seats that no one fills, conversations that trail off when the past is mentioned. It survives on paper while dying in spirit, a warning of what happens when a town builds its civilization on inheritance and intimidation instead of principle. And as the gang rides on toward Saint Denis, toward electric light and industrial promise, the question hangs in the humid air. If this is what the old world looks like when it dies, what horrors wait in the new? Saint Denis is the answer to that question. And the answer is brutal. From the very first glimpse across the bayou fog, the city rises not as a town on the frontier, but as a wall of brick, iron, and smoke that tells every outlaw on horseback, this story belongs to someone else now. Riding in, the contrast is almost disorienting. The dirt roads and wooden porches of Rhodes give way to cobbled streets, rattling streetcars, choking chimneys, and alleys that never seem to end. Carriages jam intersections, factory whistles cut through the harbor wind, and electric lights flicker above crowds that never truly sleep. Mansions in the Garden District glow with chandeliers and string quartets, while only a few blocks away, slums sag under soot and humidity. In the truest sense, Saint Denis dwarfs every settlement the gang has known, announcing that the world was changing and that the old ways were dying. Beneath that haze, money moves in currents deeper than any river. The docks are the city's beating heart, with cargo ships, barges, and rail lines tying Saint Denis to the rest of the world. Sugar from the plantations, manufactured goods from the factories. Imported luxuries for the parlors and salons all flow through the harbor. Dock workers and factory hands grind out long days for meager pay, while merchants, brokers, and industrialists skim the cream. The Garden District becomes the stage where this new aristocracy shows itself off, hosting lavish parties under gaslight as orchestras play and servants disappear into the background. It is a story of labor and luxury, of men breaking their backs so other men can toast progress with imported champagne. That progress, of course, is not shared equally. Saint Denis, from its humble beginnings, has been built on division. The city's real-world inspiration in New Orleans is clear in its racial and cultural mosaic and in its cruelty. Black and Creole residents are pushed into poorer districts and cramped tenements, their presence tolerated as long as it fuels the economy. Immigrant laborers crowd the docks and factories, spoken of as necessary and disposable in the same breath. Segregated streetcars and casual slurs in alleyway conversations reveal a civilization that preaches modernity while clinging to an old hierarchy. Politicians praise opportunity, but the city's layout tells the truth. Some lives are meant for the parlor, others for the smoke. At the top of this machine stand men who understand that in Saint Denis, power is a negotiation, not a gunfight. Mayor Lemieux smiles for the papers, speaks of reform, and trades favors behind closed doors. Angelo Bronte, the living embodiment of organized crime's new face, holds court in his mansion, controlling dock rackets, property, and even the police with quiet threats and generous donations. When Dutch's gang arrives, armed with charisma and repeaters, their usual tactics barely register. Rob a trolley, shoot a guard, cause a scene in the street, and the city simply swallows the disturbance, replacing the bodies and resuming business. Here, the endgame of the West comes into focus. Saint Denis is not impressed by romantic outlaws dreaming of freedom on open plains. It is run by men who manipulate banks, ballots, and backroom deals. Dutch senses this and tries to adapt, courting Bronte, speaking the language of influence instead of rebellion. But that attempt only exposes how out of place he truly is. His philosophy, once defiant and idealistic, becomes a performance in drawing rooms that see him as entertainment rather than threat. The gang's doomed effort to play this new game sets the stage for the Saint Denis bank heist, where the myth of the noble outlaw finally collides with the cold arithmetic of a modern city. And when that collision comes, Saint Denis will not flinch. Saint Denis smiles in marble and gaslight, but its true face waits a few streets over, where the cobblestones dissolve into mud and the air grows thick with coal dust and river rot. From its humble beginnings as a trading port to its rise as the living embodiment of modern civilization, the city has always hidden one world behind another. Walk past the theaters and salons, and the pavement narrows into crooked alleys where laundry hangs between leaning brick walls and rainwater never quite drains away. Here, cramped tenements lean over courtyards packed with barrels and broken crates, whole families pressed into single rooms while the factories roar through the night. Down by the docks, shacks huddle against the river, their boards warped and blackened, the glow of the mansions on the hill reflected in water that those workers would never dare to drink. Within a few blocks, the contrast is brutal, chandeliers on one street, coughing children on the next. In this maze, the city's philosophy of progress reveals its cost. Workers mutter about 12-hour shifts and mangled hands, about machines that never tire and foremen who never listen. Snatches of dialogue tell a story of men laid off for speaking of unionizing, of women sewing until their fingers bleed, of dockhands terrified that one wrong move will see them crushed between ship and pier. The world was changing, and every new machine in Saint Denis promised efficiency for the owners and expendability for the poor. Law patrols these streets, but not in the same way it guards the boulevards. Police march in tight lines to break up strikes, shoving nightstick and rifle barrel into crowds whose only crime is demanding to be seen. The same officers who drag a hungry man to jail for stealing bread will stroll politely past Angelo Bronte's estate, where kidnapping and extortion are just another form of business, so long as the right pockets stay lined. In the truest sense, Saint Denis does not have law. It has order, calibrated to protect property and suppress dissent. The city itself whispers what the powerful refuse to say aloud. Posters warn of cholera in the water and urge residents to boil what little they have. Newspapers buried beneath society columns mention dock accidents, dead laborers, quiet inquests that lead nowhere. Overheard conversations speak of political scandals, of rigged contracts and vanished witnesses. Stories that never reach the polished drawing rooms where Dutch now performs his speeches. The old ways were dying, but the new order was not merciful, it was merely efficient. Into this pressure cooker, the Van der Linde gang steps with a familiar plan: rob the bank, hit the system where it hurts, buy back a measure of freedom. Yet Saint Denis is not Valentine or Rhodes. It is an entire machine, gears of capital, law, and industry already grinding them down. When the bank job erupts into chaos, when Hosea and Lenny fall and the streets become a killing ground of rifles, sirens, and smoke, the failure is more than tactical. It is symbolic. Their outlaw dreams collide with a city that has already written them out of its future. And as the survivors flee into the night toward a desperate gamble across the sea, the question hangs over the blood on those marble steps. If Saint Denis could break them this easily, What will the wider world do next? If Saint Denis is the polished mask of progress, then Van Horn is the jaw rotting underneath. The gang flees the marble banks and electric lights of the city, only to find a place that shows what happens when the promises of civilization run out. In the truest sense, Van Horn is not a town. It is a shipwreck that never sank. From its humble beginnings as a rough river landing, Van Horn existed to serve the traffic on the Lanahetchee. Barges, paddle steamers, and crooked captains once made these docks loud and profitable. Now those same docks lean at sick angles over gray water, their planks split and blackened, lanterns flickering through a permanent haze of mist and tobacco smoke. Buildings slump into each other, windows boarded or broken, as if the whole settlement is slowly sliding back into the river that birthed it. The streets tell the rest of the story. Mud churned into filth, stray dogs fighting over scraps, men passed out in doorways at noon. The air is heavy with sour liquor and cheap tobacco, with the muffled thud of fists from the tavern and the crack of a rifle when some argument goes too far. Van Horn feels less like a community and more like the living embodiment of a hangover stretched across an entire coastline. The reason is simple. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. When the railroads came and larger ports blossomed, trade routes bent toward Saint Denis and never looked back. What had been a bustling river post was bypassed by iron tracks and corporate shipping. Legitimate merchants left. Pilots and captains found better harbors. What remained was whatever could cling to the carcass: smuggling, petty theft, and the desperate coins shaken from travelers who make the mistake of stopping here. Without money, law followed the merchants out of town. There is no real sheriff in Van Horn, no proper jail, no courthouse pretending to uphold a philosophy of order. Instead, there are armed locals, half-drunk enforcers, and a set of unwritten rules that shift with whoever is holding a gun. A man can be threatened for loitering on a porch while, 10 feet away, another man is knifed in the street and nobody even bothers to shout. For the Van der Linde gang, every visit to Van Horn becomes a reminder of what happens when a place falls clean through the cracks. Ambushes wait on the road in and on the road out. Inside the saloon, two men might try to rob each other at the same time, both too desperate to realize they are mirrors. Drunken brawls erupt over debts that cannot be paid. Bleak side stories unfold in corners: a ruined painter, a grieving father, a woman fleeing one nightmare only to find another. Each is a lost soul abandoned by a West that no longer has room for them. Van Horn, in the end, is a story of destination as warning. A town that once lived on the river now clings to a dead economy and bad habits, its people surviving on memory, liquor, and violence. It stands as a dark mirror of the gang's own path. Outlaws pushed aside by railroads, banks, and governments, still insisting on their freedom long after the world has priced it out. And as the gang drifts toward its final camps, the question Van Horn raises lingers over every choice that follows. When progress passes by, what is left besides decay, delusion, and the ghosts of better days? If Van Horn is the corpse of an old port town, then Annisburg is something worse, a body still moving, forced to breathe coal instead of air. From the very beginning, the town announces itself with sound and smoke, the constant roar of the mine chewing through the hills as black fumes crawl over the Kamasa River and settle on every rooftop and window. This is not a place that grew from its humble beginnings into prosperity. It is a settlement built backwards, with the mine first and the people second. Every shuddering conveyor and clanking cart dictating how families live, work, and die. The houses cling to the slope in crooked lines, their wood permanently stained a dull, greasy gray, as if the town itself is being slowly suffocated. Even the river, once a promise of trade and freedom, runs under a veil of soot, reflecting smoke instead of sky. In the truest sense, the mine is Annisburg's heart and its prison. Men descend each day into tunnels that echo real Gilded Age pits in Appalachia and the industrial West, where company towns paid wages and scrip redeemable only at their own stores. The same quiet cruelty rules here. Workers earn just enough to survive, never enough to leave. Their debts inherited by wives and children who cannot afford to start over. Children haul coal and swing picks and shafts barely high enough to stand. A story of progress written in black lung and broken bones. Arthur Morgan walks into this world not as a savior, but as a witness. Through missions with the down on his luck miner Archie and his dying wife. Through the desperate pleas of widows begging for a few dollars, His journal fills with sketches of gaunt faces and coughing children. He hears about men crushed beneath cave-ins, about bodies brought up at dawn while the foreman orders the rest back underground by noon. What does freedom mean to an outlaw when honest work is a slower execution? The company that owns Annisburg does not need gunslingers to keep order. It has something far more modern: control of law and politics. Foremen speak with the confidence of barons, sheriffs enforce company rules, and any whisper of union meetings is met with firings, threats, and quiet disappearances. The world was changing. And here the living embodiment of that change is not a noble railroad or shining city, but a ledger that values coal seams over human lungs. In Annisburg, the old ways were dying under a hail of coal dust, and the future was already here. A town where the land is stripped, the air is poison, and the only thing that grows is someone else's profit. The question is not whether places like Valentine and Rhodes will end up the same. The question is who will be crushed in the process, and who will do the crushing next. But not every town is being crushed by industry. Some are being left to rot in its shadow. Follow the river east, away from the rail lines and the coal dust, and the world seems to sag. The trees grow denser, the paths grow thinner, and then, almost by accident, a settlement appears. Butcher Creek is not a town in the usual sense. It is a cluster of warped shacks leaning over a brown, sluggish stream, mud swallowing every step, smoke hanging low as if even the air is reluctant to leave. From the very beginning, everything in Butcher Creek feels wrong to the eye. Roofs buckle under their own weight, fences collapse into the muck, and carcasses hang from porches as though decoration and necessity have become the same thing. The residents shuffle through this landscape with a haunted rhythm, eyes unfocused, limbs twisted by injury or disease, faces marked by burns, boils, and old scars that never healed clean. It looks less like a frontier settlement and more like a village that wandered out of a horror story and got lost. This is a story of isolation and poverty, of dreams that never even had the chance to fail. There is no real industry here, no mine, no ranch, no rail spur bringing in goods or hope. A few traps, a few hogs, a little moonshine. That is the economy. Cut off from the railroads and the cities that are transforming the rest of the map, Butcher Creek has turned inward. Families intermarry because there is no one else. Illness spreads because there is nowhere to send the sick. And children grow up knowing only this narrow, sinking world. In that vacuum, folklore becomes law. The people of Butcher Creek speak of curses and hexes with the same certainty that bankers in St. Denis speak of interest rates. A sick child is not just unfortunate, it is a sign. A failed crop is not bad weather, it is punishment. Without education, without doctors, without even a sheriff who cares to ride out this far, their philosophy of the world bends toward the supernatural. Fear fills the space where institutions should be. Scapegoats become easier to find than solutions. Here, the old ways were dying in a different sense. Not under the boot of civilization, but through neglect. This is what happens when a government and an economy quietly decide that a place is not worth the trouble. Roads are never built. Schools are never funded. Capital flows around Butcher Creek as if it were a rock in a stream, and the people are left as the living embodiment of abandonment, their bodies and beliefs decaying together. When the Vander Linde gang stumbles into Butcher Creek, their presence feels almost redundant. Outlaws among outcasts. Their brief, uneasy dealings here underline a hard truth. Not every tragedy on this map bears their fingerprints. Some places are already broken, already sacrificed so that more profitable towns can shine. The gang passes through, disturbed but powerless, and moves on. But Butcher Creek remains, a lost soul of a town, waiting in the dark while the world was changing somewhere else. The next settlements the gang encounters will not be this forgotten. They will be watched, measured, and priced. And that brings a different kind of curse. From the cursed hollows of Butcher Creek, the trail bends south into a different kind of darkness. Here, the land does not just threaten to kill, it tries to swallow. The bayou around Lograss is a story of water and rot, of fog and reeds, of people who learned to live where civilization refused to plant its flag. Lograss itself seems less a town than a memory clinging to the surface. Tilted houses rise above murky channels, their warped boards bleached by sun and mildew. Wooden walkways creak and sway, half drowned in places where the swamp has already won. Dense fog rolls in with the evening, muffling sound until the world collapses to the slap of water on pilings and the constant, needling chorus of insects. Frogs, birds, and distant gators call through the night, so that the whole settlement feels half real, half dream. The living embodiment of a community being slowly reclaimed by the land. In this drowned margin, the economy is as narrow and winding as the channels themselves. Men and women cast nets for catfish and perch, haul in crawdads and turtles, and track the ripple of gators through the reeds, turning scales and hides into the only currency that matters. The real trade, though, moves quieter. Smugglers run liquor, medicine, and contraband through routes only they can read, slipping past Pinkertons and St. Denis police by vanishing into side channels that do not appear on any corporate map. Their knowledge of every snag, every hidden cut, is worth more than gold. It is, in the truest sense, their freedom. Lograss's people stand apart from the main current of the game's world. Largely black and Creole, they echo real Louisiana bayou communities that preserve language, faith, and music on the margins, long after the old ways were dying elsewhere. Trapper shacks double as homes, fishing sheds as shrines, and conversations drift between French patois and English, carrying stories of ancestors who survived slavery, war, and flood by staying out of sight. The state barely notices them unless it wants something. The big railroads and oil men do not come here. That neglect becomes its own fragile shelter. When the Vander Linde gang arrives, they do not bring law, they bring need. Dutch's people steal boats in the fog, make quiet deals for passage and information, and lean on those who understand how to live outside ledgers and land deeds. Missions that pass through the bayou, sneaking toward Angelo Bronte, slipping away from St. Denis, ferrying guns and men through the reeds. Depend on guides who have been resisting formal power for generations without speeches or manifestos. Dutch preaches a philosophy of rejecting the system. But here that philosophy is not a grand idea. It is daily survival. There is irony in watching grand outlaws haggle with fishermen over a leaky skiff. Who is truly outside civilization in that moment? The gang dreaming of one last score? Or the villagers quietly profiting from their desperation? Lograss reveals that even revolutionaries need someone who knows where the water is shallow. Set against the brute force extraction of Annisburg, the contrast is brutal. There, coal is ripped from the earth until the town itself is choking to death. Here, people take only what the swamp can give back. One place is praised as progress, the other ignored as backward. Yet which has a better chance of surviving the next 20 years? The town shackled to a single dying mine, or the village that has already learned to bend with every flood, every law, every passing gang? From its humble beginnings on rotting stilts, Lograss suggests a different answer to what civilization means. Perhaps the future will not belong to those who build the tallest smokestacks, but to those who can disappear when the smokestacks fall. And as the gang's path curves back toward the bright, poisonous lights of St. Denis, that question will only grow sharper. From the misted bayous of Lograss, the trail bends north into something that, at first glance, seems far more reassuring. Emerald Ranch appears orderly, prosperous, almost peaceful. White fences run in clean lines across the hills, barns and outbuildings stand freshly painted, livestock move through pens in practiced rhythms. In a world of muddy main streets and collapsing porches, this place looks like civilization under control. That appearance is a story of its own. The corrals are full, the yards busy with ranch hands, wagons, and buyers. Emerald Ranch feeds the nearby towns with cattle, horses, and produce, a quiet agricultural engine turning behind the louder dramas of Valentine's saloons and Rhodes's decaying plantations. Where those settlements wear their chaos on their sleeves, this one hides its tensions under ledgers, gates, and hired men with rifles. It is, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of a new rural order, efficient, fenced, and profitable. Yet under that neat surface, something is wrong. From the very beginning, the main house feels empty, its windows dark, its porch strangely still. The owner, Eugene Wegner, moves through his property like a ghost, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow, temper always one harsh word from breaking. Workers glance at the house and fall silent. A photograph on a dresser, a child's room left untouched, a bloodstain in the barn that never quite fades. The game scatters clues that refuse to resolve into a comforting answer. Locals whisper about Wegner's daughter, about a girl who once laughed at the fence and dreamed of running off with a young man from the nearby moonshine operation. Some say she died in an accident, thrown from a carriage. Others hint at something uglier: abuse, a jealous father, a lover shot in the dark, and a body buried where no one will ever find it. The sheriff shrugs, the ranch hands look away, and Emerald Ranch keeps doing business. The world was changing, but some secrets remain locked behind private gates. Those gates matter. The ranch is ringed with barbed wire, patrolled by armed guards, its pastures carved into parcels of legal ownership. This is the end of the open range made visible, the moment when land stops being shared space and becomes a commodity to be defended. The old ways were dying: the drifting cattle, the open trails, the fragile idea of common freedom on the frontier, replaced by deeds, fences, and men paid to keep strangers out. For the Vander Linde gang, Emerald Ranch becomes less a refuge than a mirror. Their stolen horses and wagons do not vanish into the wilderness. They pass through the ranch's discreet fence, converted into receipts and coin. Crime here is not romantic. It is transactional. Outlaw raids feed semi-legitimate markets, and those markets, in turn, help build the very order that will crush the gang. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal in economic form, of dreams and delusions laundered through respectable books. The ranch hints at the next century, when outlaws will not disappear, but simply wear better suits. And just beyond those white fences, another town waits, ready to show how far that transformation can go when industry, politics, and blood money all share the same streets. That next town is Valentine, the living embodiment of the old frontier Main Street, and the first real taste of civilization the gang gets after the snow. Mud, manure, and music all run together there. Wagons grind through ruts, horses drink from shared troughs, and every doorway opens onto the same communal strip of road where ranchers, cowhands, outlaws, and railroad men bump shoulders without asking too many questions. From its humble beginnings as a cattle stop, Valentine grew into a rough nexus of the ranching world. The saloon doors never quite close, the hotel clerk gossips about everyone, and the livestock auctions pull in money from miles around. It is, in the truest sense, an open system. Men drift in for a season's work, take day wages, gamble them away, and move on. Arthur can drink with ranch hands, play cards with drifters, and pick up odd jobs that exist precisely because no one owns the whole town. That openness has a cost. Fights spill into the street. Lawmen are overstretched. A single bad night can end with a corpse in the mud, and nobody entirely sure whose fault it was. Yet this chaos is also a kind of freedom. The social order is loose, negotiated in real time, and there is space for a lost soul with a gun and a horse to blend in. Valentine is a story of temporary alliances, of names forgotten as soon as the train whistle fades. Emerald Ranch, just down the road, is the opposite. Where Valentine sprawls, Emerald is fenced. Where the town's animals wander through town squares and alleys, the ranch's herds are contained behind white rails, watched by armed guards and patrolled by loyal ranch hands who know exactly who belongs. The main house, barns, and corral form a tight, controlled compound, less a homestead than a private enterprise zone. Emerald represents a newer, capital-heavy philosophy of agriculture. There are wind pumps, sturdy outbuildings, hired security, and hints of side businesses and stolen goods. NPC conversations in Valentine and at neighboring farms whisper that smaller ranchers are being squeezed, forced to sell breeding stock or land to cover debts, while Emerald keeps expanding. One hand mutters that the rancher out by the Heartland's oil derrick had to take a loan. Another that the Deucent family sold their last good bull to that Emerald fella or lose the place. In this world, the old ways were dying. Free grazing cowboys and independent drovers find fewer open ranges and more locked gates. Work still exists, but now it comes as wage labor under watchful eyes, time cards instead of handshakes, pay envelopes instead of a share of the herd. Men like Arthur and John, raised in a drifting outlaw family, discover that even honest ranch work is being centralized into fortified estates with no patience for unregistered guns or unasked questions. The rumors around Emerald's missing daughter, its nighttime gunshots, and its silent, hostile owner add another layer. Power is becoming quieter, more private, more insulated from public judgment. The law barely steps in, not because nothing is wrong, but because this kind of wealth polices itself. How does an outlaw gang fight something that never rides into town, never draws on them in the street, but simply buys the land out from under their horses? By the time the gang leaves the heartlands behind, the pattern is clear. Valentine offers a fading glimpse of the communal West. Emerald Ranch foreshadows a lockdown future where capital, not courage, decides who eats. The real enemy is not just the Pinkertons on the horizon, but this slow enclosure of fields and futures that makes Dutch's philosophy obsolete before the gunsmoke even clears. And as the gang pushes south into a town ruled not by fences but by feuds, that truth will come for them in ways none of them are ready to see. South of the Grizzlies and west of the coal smoke, New Hanover opens up into something that looks, at first glance, like freedom. Wide skies over the heartlands, rolling grass broken by wind-warped trees, herds of wild horses cutting across the horizon. It feels untouched, but it is already a story of a country being carved into pieces long before the first shot is fired in roads. From its humble beginnings as open range and hunting ground, this region has become a patchwork of old and new claims. Valentine squats in a shallow basin of mud and timber, a ranching town clinging to cattle and card games. To the east, Emerald Ranch sits behind its white fences and boarded windows, the living embodiment of money trying to domesticate the prairie. Beyond that, the tracks bend north toward Annisburg, where cliffs and forest give way to slag heaps and choking fog. Between these points, scattered homesteads, tenant farms, and half-finished fences mark where the old ways were dying under surveyor's ink. The railroads tie it all together, or strangle it. Iron lines cut across the plains in hard, unwavering strokes, deciding which places matter and which become ghosts. A station in Valentine turns a muddy main street into a commercial artery, cattle and passengers flowing in and out with the timetables. Emerald Ranch thrives because its private platform plugs directly into that skeleton of the new America, its livestock and secrets shipped quietly under corporate contracts. Ride a little off the line to some forgotten homestead with no siding, and the silence tells the rest of the story. No trains, no buyers, no future. Documents scattered in cabins and offices hint at what is coming next. Survey maps pinned to walls, letters about land companies buying up unused acreage, deeds that speak louder than any handshake ever could. In the truest sense, paper has become a weapon. What once belonged to whoever could hold it now belongs to whoever can prove it. The state's philosophy is simple. Lines on a map are more real than the people already living between them. That logic does not distinguish between those people. Native communities pushed out of the heartlands decades earlier, small ranchers clinging to family spreads, tenant farmers renting from absentee owners, all are obstacles to be cleared when coal, rail, or large-scale agriculture wants their ground. The game rarely lingers on these stories, but the evidence is everywhere. An abandoned camp with charred totems near the Dakota, a foreclosed farmstead, children's toys left in the dirt, a company man in Annisburg bragging that the mine will civilize the whole valley. In this tightening net, the Vanderlinde gang survives in the gaps. Their camp at Horseshoe Overlook literally hangs above the rail line, close enough to watch the trains. Far enough to stay off the ledgers, they move along creek beds, through windbreaks, into wooded hollows that have not yet been measured. Always one survey, one railroad extension, one Pinkerton report away from erasure. How long can outlaws live in a world where every hill has a name, every acre a price, every trail a future road? The answer will follow them south, where blood ties and family feuds pretend to defy progress, even as the same invisible forces tighten their grip. Those invisible forces have borders, and in the north, those borders are drawn by ice and stone. Before rail lines, before surveyors, before proper deeds, the Grizzlies stand as a wall the new world can measure itself against, and more often than not, lose. This is a story of ambition frozen in place, of dreams buried where no one bothers to dig them up. Coulter is the proof. From its humble beginnings as a cluster of rough-hewn cabins pressed against a mountainside, it was never much, yet someone once believed it could be everything. The snow presses against warped doors, wind howls through broken shutters, and half-frozen crates of tinned food and mining gear sit abandoned as if the men who owned them stepped out for a moment and never came back. The stillness is not peaceful. It feels interrupted, unfinished, a town that died before it ever had the chance to live. In the truest sense, Coulter is not a town at all, but the outline of one. No church steeple, no main street, no saloon pulling in drifters and railroad men, just bunkhouses, a few storage sheds, a collapsed stable, and a frozen trail snaking down toward nothing. It fits into a wider pattern that defined the frontier long before Saint Denis paved its streets. Speculative camps thrown up on rumors of gold, veins of coal, or promised logging contracts that never quite materialized. When the rumor failed, the people left. The cabins stayed, waiting for the next desperate soul. The grizzlies themselves explain why those rumors so often died. This is not the gentle, rolling country around Valentine, or the river-fed wealth of Lemoyne. This is a region where blizzards erase trails overnight, where avalanches answer dynamite, and where a single misstep on a ridge means a fall no doctor can mend. The terrain resists the kind of industrial development that turns Annisburg's cliffs into blackened scars, or St. Denis's swamps into rail yards. What remains instead are scattered trappers, isolated homesteads, and ventures that fail quietly, leaving only rotting beams and half-dug shafts. Rock carvings on distant peaks, forgotten mine entrances, and ruined hunting blinds all whisper the same philosophy in their silence. Not every frontier effort ends in a bustling main street. Arthur's journal sketches lonely cabins and abandoned wagons, noting how the world was changing even here, yet could not fully claim this place. Maps hint at planned routes that never cut through these passes, survey lines that stop abruptly at the first serious ridge. The old ways were dying, but in the Grizzlies, the new ways never quite arrived. So when the Vander Linde gang staggers into Coulter after Blackwater, half frozen and bleeding, they are not pioneers. They are occupants of someone else's abandoned future. Their campfires flicker in hearths built for men who lost this gamble already. Their whispered plans echoing in rooms that have heard all those speeches before. Dutch promises that this is only a pause, that freedom waits just beyond the thaw, yet the setting betrays him. The gang's idealistic talk of family, loyalty, and escape is framed by sagging roofs and snow-choked paths, a living embodiment of a dream already proved impossible. Is it coincidence that their first refuge is a failed camp? That their new beginning is housed in the corpse of another man's enterprise? Or is Coulter a warning, a quiet prophecy that this outlaw family, too, will end as empty cabins and fading smoke? As the snows begin to melt and the gang rides south, the question follows them down the mountain. And the land they enter next pretends to offer something the Grizzlies never could: belonging, blood, and a home worth killing for. But belonging, in this world, is never simple. As the gang rides toward the promise of warmer winds and open plains, the map itself delivers a harsh correction, revealing a place where the idea of home has been stripped down to bare earth and splintered boards: the Wapiti Reservation. From its humble beginnings as a hunting ground rich with game and clear water, this valley has been reduced to a handful of weather-beaten lodges, a government tent, and a lonely flag whipping in the wind. The land stretches wide and beautiful, but the settlement is cramped and starved, ringed by soldiers and surveyors instead of buffalo and free-roaming horses. It is, in the truest sense, a story of contraction. A people who once moved with the seasons now fixed in place by barbed wire, borders, and broken promises. The reservation's sparse buildings say as much as any crowded main street. A small agency office replaces the courthouse. A ration wagon replaces the general store. There is no saloon, no theater, no railway platform promising arrival and departure. The world was changing, but here that change takes the form of absence, of things that should have been built and never were. Where Valentine grew around cattle and roads around cotton, Wapiti is forced to grow around paperwork, patrols, and the slow suffocation of imposed dependence. Behind that emptiness stand policies and profits. Federal agents speak the language of civilization and progress, but the oil companies' derricks and survey stakes reveal the real philosophy at work. This land is not being protected so much as held in escrow until the right men can drill it dry. Independent native towns, with their own economies and power, would complicate the ledger. So the people are corralled instead into an under-resourced pocket, close enough to control, far enough to ignore, their freedom carefully measured out in rations and reprimands. Caught in the middle stand Chief Rainsfall and his son Eagle Flies, two men staring at the same horizon and seeing different paths to survival. Rainsfall pleads, negotiates, clings to a fragile hope that words and dignity can outlast rifles and railroads. Eagle Flies burns to fight, to answer betrayal with bullets and fire. Yet both are already trapped inside a system that has priced their homeland and assigned its future owners. Whether they bend or break, The ledger has decided who profits. The absence of a bustling native town on the map becomes its own kind of negative storytelling. The game shows forts, depots, plantations, mining camps, and then leaves this wound of an almost town, a community frozen at the edge of becoming. That silence asks a quiet question. What would Wapiti look like if it had been allowed to thrive? A market? A school? A railroad stop bearing a Lakota name instead of an oil company's brand? Seen from this valley, every thriving town the gang visits carries a shadow. St. Denis, Annisburg, Blackwater, even the most modest ranching hamlet, all stand on land that once sustained other families, other dreams. The complete history of these settlements is inseparable from the histories they erase, from the old ways that were dying not by accident, but by design. And as the gang rides on, chasing its own fading vision of freedom, it does so across a map already written over in someone else's blood and signatures. From that blood-soaked foundation, the contrast between Strawberry and Wapiti feels almost theatrical. On one ridge sits a postcard frontier town, all tidy boardwalks and decorative bridges. On the other, a scarred reservation where the buildings are bare, functional, and fragile against the wind. Both exist on contested land. Only one is allowed to pretend the contest is over. Strawberry is the living embodiment of a curated frontier fantasy. Its wooden bridge arches gracefully over the river, its storefronts are freshly painted, its streets are swept. The mayor struts through town in fine clothes, rehearsing his speeches, forever selling an image of rustic charm to visiting tourists and investors. From its humble beginnings as a logging settlement, Strawberry has reinvented itself as a safe, scenic outpost where civilization can play at being wild without ever feeling truly threatened. Wapiti, by contrast, is a story of survival after the dream has already been stolen. The tents and shacks are arranged for practicality, not display. There are no ornate porches, no decorative lamps, no investment in comfort for the sake of appearances. The people live under constant pressure from the federal government and Cornwall's corporate interests, pushed onto poor land and then punished when that land proves valuable. The world was changing, and for the Wapiti, it changed at gunpoint. In Strawberry, leadership courts outside Capitol. The mayor woos tourists, business partners, and the state, promising timber, clean air, and compliant citizens. Money flows in the form of bridges, jail cells, and an orderly main street that signals legal recognition and long-term backing. In Wapiti, rains fall and eagle flies are forced into a different kind of diplomacy, negotiating not for prosperity but for the right to exist at all. Their philosophy is not expansion but endurance, a bitter struggle to keep what little remains. The imbalance is stark. When Strawberry needs something, it petitions. When Wapiti resists, troops arrive. Strawberry receives infrastructure, lawmen, and political attention. Wapiti receives broken treaties, poisoned water, and the threat of annihilation whenever it stands in the way of oil and rail. One community is folded into the story of progress. The other is treated as an obstacle to be removed, in the truest sense of the word. The Vander Linde gang rides between these worlds without fully seeing the pattern. They rob Strawberry's citizens, kidnap its mayor, exploit its relative safety, and then ride north to aid the Wapiti in open rebellion, convinced they are striking blows for freedom. Yet both actions orbit the same system that is closing in on them, the same machinery of capital and control that will crush their own outlaw family when it outlives its usefulness. Who really has freedom here, and who only has the illusion of choice? By the time the smoke clears, the fate of each settlement is bound to who controls the land beneath it, and whose stories are allowed to be built in wood and stone instead of left as ashes and memories. No town on this map stands alone. Each is a chapter in a larger narrative of ownership and erasure, a prelude to the next place where the gang will ride in. Chasing dreams that were doomed from the very beginning, the smoke clears and the camera shifts south. If Valentine and Strawberry hint at who owns the frontier, Rhodes and St. Denis reveal who is allowed to exist within civilization at all. These are not just towns on a map. They are diagrams of power drawn in brick, mud, and railroad steel. Rhodes shows this in the truest sense. From its humble beginnings as a plantation market, every street still bends around the Braithwaite and Gray estates, even after the Civil War has supposedly ended their world. The grand houses sit on high ground, wrapped in oaks and fences, while black workers and poor whites are pushed to the periphery, into sagging shacks and cabins half swallowed by swamp. They are close enough to pick cotton, pour drinks, and dig graves, but far from the courthouse porch where the men with names on land deeds lean in their rocking chairs and pretend the old ways were not built on chains. Walk through roads, and the pattern repeats. The main street is a stage for respectability: the saloon, the gunsmith, the general store, all watched over by sheriffs tied to the grays. Behind them, down back alleys and side yards, the labor that keeps the town running is hidden from view. A black stable hand here, a field hand there, always entering through side doors and service gates. What looks like a sleepy southern town is, in reality, a story of who steps through the front entrance and who is kept behind the scenes. Saint Denis takes that philosophy and industrializes it. Inspired by New Orleans, the city is the living embodiment of a world racing toward modernity while dragging slavery's shadow behind it. The mansions and offices ring the central squares, the banks and theaters glow with electric light, and the police patrol the boulevards in clean uniforms, protecting property more than people. Yet the black neighborhoods, immigrant quarters, and workers' shacks are pushed to the edges, down by the reeking docks, out near the factories, behind walls of smoke and noise. The poor are packed into rotting houses, flooded streets, and cramped courtyards, always within reach as servants and stevedores, never near the levers of power. The city's details make the hierarchy impossible to ignore. Segregated streetcars roll along the tracks, an everyday reminder that even motion is divided by race. Racist graffiti stains brick walls, slurs scrawled where the law does not bother to look. Public parks and promenades are patrolled, while whole blocks of shotgun houses rot uninspected. Discrimination is not just a matter of cruel men with badges and torches. It is embedded in which streets are lit, which pipes carry clean water, which districts flood first when the rain comes. Into this architecture of race and class rides the Van der Linde gang, a wandering contradiction. Mixed in blood, united in outlaw status. They move between these worlds without ever belonging to any of them. Charles and Lenny feel the weight of Southern racism directly, while Arthur, Dutch, and the others drift in and out of privilege, sometimes using it, sometimes smashing against it. One day they help oppressed workers or rescue captives. The next they rob the same communities blind. They fight the system and feed on it, chasing freedom while living off the very hierarchies they claim to despise. In Rhodes and Saint Denis, their story collides with a harsher truth. There are people who can never just ride on. For the town's black residents and poorest laborers, there is no new camp over the next hill, no fresh start in another state. The map's borders are not lines on paper. They are walls of custom and violence. Who can stroll down Main Street without fear? Who is always one wrong look away from a beating, an arrest, a lynching? The complete history of these places is not measured in robberies and shootouts, but in who is allowed to feel at home and who is forever treated as a trespasser in their own world. And as the gang's path turns north and west again, toward mines, oil fields, and dying boomtowns, that same invisible architecture will follow them, reshaped but never gone. That invisible architecture becomes brutally visible in Annisburg. From its humble beginnings as a small riverside mining camp, it has hardened into the purest expression of a company town, the mine at its heart, the company store at its throat, the company housing wrapped around it like a noose. The smoke, the noise, the coughing children on the docks. This is industrial progress stripped of romance. In Annisburg, everything is owned. Wages are paid in cash, then clawed back through inflated prices at the store and rent on shacks that barely hold out the wind. Contracts, ledgers, and pay slips hang over every family. Exploitation is not a brawl in the street. It is a signature on a dotted line, a foreman's warning, a quiet threat that there are always more desperate men waiting for work. The world was changing, and the mine owners made sure that change flowed upward. The gang's brief time here drives the point home. When Arthur escorts Edith Downs and her dying husband's legacy of debt through Annisburg, he is not facing a single villain. He is moving through an entire system that has already decided who gets to live and who gets ground down. The town is, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of Dutch's old speeches about civilization as a cage. But now the cage has numbers, timetables, and shareholders. Then, just down the river, the cage falls apart. Van Horn is what happens when there is no company strong enough, or interested enough to pretend there is order. Where Annisburg has rows of worker housing, Van Horn has collapsing shacks and warped porches. Where Annisburg has the mine and the store, Van Horn has failing saloons, boarded-up businesses, and a dockyard that feels one bad storm away from vanishing entirely. Here, exploitation is improvised. It happens in bar fights that end with a body in the mud, in scams where a drunk wakes up robbed, in the constant low-level threat that anyone might pull a gun for a handful of coins. No contracts, no payslips, just opportunity and violence circling each other in the dark. Is this freedom, or just another prison with the bars knocked down? Both towns are dead ends. In Annisburg, the miners and their families cannot afford to leave. The cost of a train ticket might as well be a mansion. In Van Horn, there is nowhere better to go and no resources to get there. A man can drink himself senseless by the water and still be exactly where he started when the sun comes up. Every lost soul here is stuck between the old ways we're dying and a future that never arrives. Their relationship to the state could not be more different. Annisburg is plugged into national markets and politics. Its coal feeds railroads and factories. Its profits grease distant hands in St. Denis and beyond. Van Horn, by contrast, feels written off. A place lawmen visit only to dump trouble or pass through. One town is crushed by visibility, the other by neglect. By the time the gang drifts through these places, their own story of freedom and philosophy is collapsing in parallel. Dutch speaks of civilization's cruelty, while hiding in a town literally owned by capital, then skulks through a port where civilization has abandoned even the pretense of order. They are no longer witnessing the birth of the frontier, they are walking through its decomposition, industrial and social, legal and lawless. And just beyond these ruined edges, something even harsher waits, places where the land itself has been poisoned, where the promise of progress curdles into open sickness, and the cost of survival finally becomes impossible to ignore. Beyond those poisoned edges stand two cities that do not look sick at all. They look triumphant. St. Denis and Blackwater, gleaming proof that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, even as their streets run quiet over buried blood. St. Denis is the living embodiment of industrial sprawl. Smokestacks, rail yards, slaughterhouses, refineries, slums pressed up against mansions and marble halls of government. It is a story of progress and exploitation, of order and barely concealed chaos, all jammed into one choking skyline. The city grows outward in every direction, devouring bayou and farmland, pulling in labor, money, and power from across the nation. In the truest sense, it is already plugged into a national market, ruled by men who speak of civilization while dealing behind closed doors with Bronte, Cornwall, and the Lemieux machine. Blackwater, by contrast, feels calm. Cleaner, planned, its streets are paved and gridded, its lamps electric, its docks neat and efficient rather than sprawling and filthy. Yet that difference is less contradiction than chronology. If St. Denis is the fully grown beast, Blackwater is the same animal from its humble beginnings. A younger stage of urban development built with federal money, railroad capital, and a clear vision of what the frontier is supposed to become. One city rises from an old southern port, the other from the edge of open range, but both answer to the same distant centers of authority. Walk through Blackwater and St. Denis in 1899, and the parallels are unmistakable. Streetcars ring their bells in St. Denis. Blackwater has its tidy boardwalks and telegraph wires. The St. Denis docks choke on cargo from across the world. Blackwater's harbor is smaller, but just as carefully managed, a controlled gate between river, lake, and interior. Both advertise freedom and opportunity, yet every brick whispers of ownership, surveillance, and law. Even the architecture tells the same story. Brick, glass, and steel pushing out wood, mud, and open sky. Yet for all their polish, both cities are built over catastrophe. The Blackwater ferry robbery, the massacre that haunts the entire game, should stain the town forever. Instead, it becomes a cautionary tale that justifies more Pinkertons, more patrols, more fences. The St. Denis bank disaster kills Hosea and Lenny in broad daylight and sprays blood across the marble of respectable finance. Within days, the narrative hardens, dangerous outlaws, brave lawmen, a regrettable but necessary show of force. Progress demands sacrifice. Whose sacrifice rarely matters. In these narratives, there is no place for Dutch's philosophy or Arthur's doubts. The gang is driven from Blackwater before the story even begins and spat out of St. Denis in the middle of it, exposed as relics in a world that has already decided what civilization will look like. They can rob trains in the wilderness, burn plantations, terrorize remote sheriffs, but they cannot hold ground in the twin capitals of this new West. And after their fall, those capitals will only grow. By 1911, Blackwater in particular becomes the default center of gravity, the place where federal agents, corporate barons, and new money converge. St. Denis and Blackwater will rewrite the region's history in their own image, turning men like Dutch and Arthur into cautionary monsters or forgotten footnotes, proof that the frontier had to die so the modern world could be born. But there is one more place that refuses to fit neatly into that story, a town where progress stalls, disease festers, and the promise of this new order rots in the sun. That rot is not just in the streets or the water, it runs through the ink. In this world, the first true monument of civilization is not the courthouse or the railway bridge, but the newspaper stand on the corner, quietly turning chaos into columns. From its humble beginnings in Valentine's muddy main street to the grand presses of St. Denis, print becomes the in-universe historian of the Van der Linde era. Each town's paper tells a story of what happened, what should have happened, and what must never be admitted. The New Hanover Gazette reports on the Valentine bank robbery as a brazen assault on honest commerce, praising the swift response of lawmen, yet it never mentions the desperation in Arthur's eyes or the gang's belief that the system is rigged beyond repair. In Rhodes, the local broadsheet treats the Braithwaite, gray bloodbath as an unfortunate disturbance to genteel plantation life, sanitizing years of racial violence and debt peonage into a few lines about unrest. St. Denis takes that distortion to an art form. Its papers frame the St. Denis bank job as an attack on progress itself, a barbaric outburst by faceless outlaws against a city that is the living embodiment of order and prosperity. Dutch's rhetoric about freedom, corruption, and the rich feeding on the poor vanishes between the advertisements for luxury goods and new streetcar lines. The world was changing, and the headlines insist that only one side of that change deserves to be remembered. Yet the streets argue back. Overheard conversations in saloons, on sidewalks, and in factories reveal a second history, messier and more human. In Valentine, ranch hands grumble that the gang had guts, even as they curse the lost wages from a shuttered bank. In Rhodes, store clerks whisper that the Grays and Braithwaites got what was coming, while old men on porches mourn the passing of proper families. In St. Denis, dock workers mutter that the rich brought the violence on themselves, but the clerks in bowler hats only fear the disruption to business. Sometimes the irony is almost cruel. A drunk in a St. Denis bar boasts about the bravery of the very lawmen who had been hiding in alleys when the shooting started. Two gamblers in Rhodes argue over who shot whom during the plantation raid. Both of them wrong, both of them certain. Truth becomes a card game, not a record. As the months pass, the pattern shifts. Early on, the Van der Linde gang dominates the front pages, bank robberies, train holdups, daring escapes. Then, slowly, their exploits slide into side columns and back pages. Displaced by election results, new rail contracts, industrial accidents in Annisburg, business ventures in Blackwater. The old ways were dying. Even the outlaws who fought that death are reduced to background noise beneath stock prices and civic announcements. By the time John Marston walks these same streets, the gang's legend survives only in half-remembered gossip and yellowed clippings. The complete history of every town is revealed as a contested battlefield. What the player witnesses, what the characters whisper, and what the newspapers print are three overlapping, never identical versions of the same events. Which one becomes real in the truest sense? That depends on who controls the next headline, and who is left alive to argue with it. Those headlines belong to the towns. But between every printed column and every painted storefront, there is another story of America unfolding in canvas and campfire smoke. The Van der Linde gang does not live in Valentine or Rhodes or St. Denis. It lives in the gaps between them. From the very beginning of 1899, the pattern is clear. After the frozen purgatory of Coulter, the gang drags itself down into the green hills above Valentine and settles at Horseshoe Overlook. The camp perches on a bluff just far enough from the main road that travelers hear the laughter, but rarely see the tents. Below, Valentine is the living embodiment of a frontier market town, corrals, saloons, a muddy main street laid out in crude lines. Above, the gang builds a crooked little village of wagons, lean toes, and a single iron rule. Susan Grimshaw's word is law. These camps function as shadow communities, mirroring the towns they feed on. There is an economy, with Pearson's ledger, Strauss's loans, and Arthur's hunting sustaining the whole. There is a hierarchy, with Dutch and Hosea as elder statesmen, Grimshaw as magistrate, and the rest slotted into roles they never voted on. There is even a philosophy, Dutch's ever-expanding sermon about freedom and civilization, repeated around the fire until it sounds less like rebellion and more like a fragile prayer. In the truest sense, this is a town that refuses to admit it is one. Proximity shapes everything. Near Valentine, opportunity means drunken ranch hands with loose wallets and an under-policed bank. Danger means brawls that spill into the mud, a dead O'Driscoll on a hitching post, and the slow attention of the law. When the heat grows, the entire town of canvas uproots and slides south, reappearing as Clemens Point, tucked into the moss-draped shore of Flatiron Lake, a short ride from the genteel Decay of Rhodes. Here the contrast sharpens. Rhodes presents itself as orderly, a central street, whitewashed porches, a courthouse that promises justice. Behind the trees, the gang's camp sprawls in organic circles around the fire. No streets, no fences, only paths worn by habit and argument. The old ways were dying in Rhodes, replaced by railroads and plantation debts. But in camp, the illusion of an older freedom survives. Yet that freedom depends on exploiting the very town it despises, running errands for Braithwaites and Grays until the feud turns the surrounding fields into a graveyard. St. Denis forces another move. Shady Belle, a rotting plantation house in the bayou, becomes an outlaw suburb of a modern city. The gang hides among the cypress and fog while Dutch chases big dreams in the gridded streets and electric glow of St. Denis. Every trip in is a risk, every trip out brings back money, ideas, and more Pinkertons. When that balance finally collapses, the camp is driven to Beaver Hollow, a damp cave pressed against the edge of Annisburg's mining empire, where the world was changing faster than Dutch could lie. Each relocation pushes the gang further into the leftover spaces, steeper hillsides, darker woods, narrower margins between rail lines and ravines. With every new town added to the map, there is one less place to disappear. How long can an outlaw town without streets survive in a world that is busy paving every road it finds? But the map does not close in through rail lines and telegraph poles alone. It tightens through men with badges, ledgers, and warrants, carrying the town's will into places that were never meant to answer to any town at all. From its humble beginnings, the frontier sheriff was meant to be the living embodiment of local order. A single man, a star on his chest, a shotgun in his hands, and a jury that often met on the porch. In Valentine, that ideal still flickers. Sheriff Malloy is overworked, underpaid, and constantly cleaning up after drunken ranch hands and passing outlaws. He is not brilliant, but he is not cruel. His office is a story of a world that still believes law is a neighbor's face, not a corporation's contract. Strawberry tells a different tale. Its sheriff bends easily to Mayor Goodman's vanity project, arresting or releasing people based on what helps the town's image. Civilization here is a theater, and law is a stagehand. Then there is Rhodes, where Sheriff Lee Gray wears the badge, while his own family profits from smuggling and quiet terror. In the truest sense, his office is a front, a polite handshake covering the Braithwaite gray rot underneath. Competence, corruption, dependence on local elites, each town mixes those elements in its own way, but all share one truth. Their power used to end where the dirt road faded into trees. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency changes that. Hired by railroads, banks, and industrial capital, it moves past county lines and state borders, answering less to juries than to balance sheets. Milton and Ross do not care whether Valentine's sheriff is honest or Rhodes' sheriff is bought. Their mandate is simple: protect assets, crush unions, hunt outlaws. They are a story of law turned into a business model. Once the Pinkertons step onto the board, the dynamic shifts. Towns no longer need to chase gangs with half-drunk posses and borrowed rifles. They can outsource the hard work and the dirty work to a professional, quasi-corporate force that brings its own men, its own files, its own philosophy of order. What happens to frontier freedom when enforcement is franchised? The game marks this shift with precision. The Valentine altercation with the O'Driscolls still feels local, a bar fight that spills into the street. But by the time the Pinkertons ambush the gang on the shores near Clemens Point, or ride into the party at the mayor's mansion in St. Denis. The tone has changed. Their raid on Shady Belle, their encirclement of the St. Denis Bank, turned private feuds into federal-scale manhunts. Each Pinkerton appearance signals that the gang is no longer just offending a sheriff, it is offending an emerging system. The old ways were dying, not only under smokestacks and factory whistles, but under ledgers, dossiers, and wanted posters that crossed jurisdictions. The frontier is closing because surveillance, communication, and hired enforcement are finally catching up to the mythology of the outlaw. Dutch imagines himself a lost soul battling corrupt civilization. In reality, the net around his wandering camp is being drawn by men who do not care about his philosophy at all. And as that net tightens, even the smallest town must choose, remain a lonely outpost, or plug itself into the growing machinery that will decide who may live free and who must hang. For Valentine, that choice is not made in a single speech or a single hanging. It plays out in glances, in gossip, in the way the town flinches when riders thunder in from the hills. The story of this muddy little rail stop becomes a quiet ledger of fear and consequence, written after the gunsmoke has drifted away. Return here after the great catastrophes of the year, and the change is immediate. The main street that once greeted the gang from its humble beginnings as a carefree playground of whiskey and fistfights now sits under a sharper gaze. Lawmen linger on corners instead of drifting through. Patrols ride the outskirts. The sheriff's office, once half asleep, now bristles with extra deputies and hard-eyed strangers in tailored coats, the living embodiment of a state that has decided this town will be tamed. Townsfolk, who once laughed at brawls, now cut conversations short when an armed stranger passes. Voices drop. Doors close faster. Conversations in the saloon tell the same tale. Where there was rowdy banter about horses and card games, there are hushed arguments over Pinkertons, over the bank job, over whether the bar fight that started it all was a warning they failed to heed. New wanted posters paper the walls, some bearing familiar silhouettes, others promising rewards for nameless associates. The newspapers on the tables no longer speak of Valentine as a backwater, but as a flashpoint in a wider campaign against outlaw gangs. Even the wording betrays a philosophy shift. Less talk of justice, more of order, efficiency, civilization. The physical scars are only part of it. A few businesses never quite recover from the chaos. A shuttered window here, a boarded door there, routines altered so that shops close earlier, and ranch hands come to town in smaller warrior groups. Stable boys complain about fewer travelers. Working men mutter about wages not keeping up with prices, about railroad contracts going elsewhere. Their dialogue grows edged with desperation, with the quiet understanding that the world was changing and that the old ways were dying, even in a place built on mud and cattle. For the Van der Linde gang, Valentine ceases to be a haven and becomes a mirror. Early in 1899, it is a story of freedom and bravado, a stage where Dutch's idealistic speeches seem to match the wide sky. Later, it feels cramped, watched, poisoned by their own legend. The same streets that once rang with their laughter now carry rumors of betrayal, of doomed dreams, of a lost soul who thought he could outrun civilization on horseback. In the truest sense, the town survives. The map still bears its name, trains still stop, cattle still move. But the Valentine that welcomed drifters at the very beginning of this saga is gone. In its place stands a town that has learned to tense at the echo of hoofbeats, waiting to see if the next rider brings business, or the next chapter in its slow, uneasy decline. If Valentine is the story of a town learning to flinch, Rhodes is the story of a town learning to go quiet. After the fire at Braithwaite Manor and the ruin of both great houses, the air around Rhodes seems thinner, as if the place itself is holding its breath. The old ways were dying in front of everyone, and no one quite knew what would replace them. From its humble beginnings, Rhodes had been the living embodiment of plantation power. Braithwaite men and gray men rode through town armed to the teeth. Deputies and hired guns blurred together, and the line between law and feud was almost imaginary. In the aftermath, those mounted patrols vanish. The streets are emptier. The few remaining guards lean in doorways instead of parading, rifles slung but rarely raised. Even the saloon piano feels hesitant, its music drifting through a town still smelling of smoke from a house that no longer exists. With the old elites broken, the badge in Rhodes means something different, and much less. Sheriff Gray is gone, his office a shell of its former authority, and the deputies who remain have neither the numbers nor the backing to dominate the county. Smaller merchants, feed store owners, and the sturdier surviving landowners begin to step into the vacuum, but they inherit responsibility without resources, authority without real power. A clerk mutters about new arrangements. A storekeeper complains that credit has dried up. Civilization is still the goal, but the scaffolding that held it up has been kicked away. In this quieter roads, conversations carry. NPCs talk about the feud in low, fearful tones, turning recent history into a cautionary tale. A townsman remarks that the Braithwaites and Greys near took the whole county with them, while another warns that rich folks' quarrels have a habit of landing on poor folks' backs. Among black residents, the fear is sharper, more precise. A laborer near the tracks notes how fast the law came down when a white boy went missing, compared to the silence when black workers were beaten or disappeared. For them, the feud is not just tragedy, it is proof that their lives are collateral in someone else's war. Into that memory creeps another story, the outlaws who came and went. The Van der Linde gang becomes local folklore almost overnight, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, told over cheap whiskey. In the saloon, men argue about whether those outsiders were heroes for humiliating the Braithwaites, or devils who stirred the pot and rode off before the boiling started. One swears he saw Arthur Morgan laughing with Sheriff Gray. Another swears the same man rode with the Braithwaites at night. Both might be right. That is the irony of roads. The town cannot even agree on how it was used. The gang moves on, chasing freedom, philosophy, and one more score, but the places it touches are left to live with the consequences. Road survives, in the truest sense, yet with fewer illusions and fewer options. It's people staring down a future without masters they trusted or outlaws to blame. And as the smoke over Scarlet Meadows finally thins, another town waits on the horizon, already shaped by forces even more ruthless than a family feud. That next town is no quiet frontier hamlet, but the beating industrial heart of the region. St. Denis rises out of the mist in the epilogue as it did in 1899, smoke on the horizon, bells and whistles in the distance, a story of money, motion, and amnesia. The world was changing here faster than anywhere else, and it never paused long enough to mourn. By the early 1900s, St. Denis is slightly cleaner at the edges, yet no less overwhelming. Some alleys are paved, gutters run a little clearer, and the worst piles of refuse have been pushed back from the main avenues, but the core remains the same restless organism. Carriages rattle past electric street lamps, trolleys screech along segregated tracks, and the docks still thunder with cargo that feeds distant markets. In the truest sense, the city has not repented, it has simply grown. From its humble beginnings as a swamp trading post, St. Denis has always devoured stories and turned them into background noise. The gang's St. Denis bank job once dominated every whispered conversation, every newspaper headline, every drunken rant in the saloons by the river. Now, in the epilogue, those events linger only as half-remembered gossip. A barkeep might mention that robbery years back with the same tone used for a bad storm. An old dock worker might recall a rich Italian who crossed the wrong men without remembering Angelo Bronte's name. Bronte's corpse was once a symbol of power shifting in the dark corners of civilization. By the time John returns, it is just another entry in a long ledger of betrayals and disappearances. New scandals have taken center stage, municipal corruption trials, railway contracts, debates over suffrage and labor. The mayor's intrigues, corporate land grabs, and the quiet expansion of federal authority drown out the memory of one outlaw gang's brief rampage. History moves fast where money moves faster, yet the city's surface tells its own story of progress. New construction rises near the tram yards. Brick warehouses replace older wooden sheds along the waterfront. Telegraph wires multiply overhead, and more electric lights burn away the night, each bulb the living embodiment of a future that no longer has room for men like Dutch or Arthur. Police patrols seem better organized, their routes more disciplined, their uniforms sharper. The old ways were dying here long before the gang arrived, but now the death feels complete. Into this churn walks John Marston. Once an outlaw ghost slipping through back alleys, he is now a man trying to pass as respectable in a city that barely glances his way. Clerks ignore him unless he blocks the counter. Bankers look through him unless he causes trouble. In a bitter irony, the man who helped bring St. Denis to a standstill now struggles just to hail a cab. What does it mean when a former legend cannot even get a cab driver to stop? For John, every corner holds a phantom. Lenny laughing on a balcony, Hosea watching the streets, Dutch promising freedom amid the smoke. For Saint Denis, those are just shadows swallowed by new lights. This is a story of memory and erasure, of dreams and delusions colliding with a city that refuses to stand still. In places like Saint Denis, history is not a monument, it is a current. The gang's saga was one brief flare in a skyline that keeps adding lamps, towers, and smokestacks, already preparing to forget the next lost soul who tries to stand against it. But if Saint Denis is a current, always moving, Annisburg is a pit. It does not flow, it is dug. From its humble beginnings as a cluster of shacks above a coal seam, the town was never meant to last. It was an extraction site given a name, a place where civilization arrived only to better feed the furnaces somewhere else. Coal seams are promises with an expiration date. In the real world, mining towns from Appalachia to the Ruhr Valley rose almost overnight, then withered just as quickly once the seams thinned, markets shifted, or cheaper fuel appeared. The very beginning of Annisburg's story is already its end. The coal is finite. The rail spur is single-purpose. The river choked with slag and ash. This is not a diversified frontier hub. It is a single bet placed on a single resource. The game quietly shows that the bet is being burned through at a brutal pace. The mine runs at all hours. The air is a permanent haze. Men cough in the streets, foremen bark orders, and company guards hover at the edges, the living embodiment of a philosophy that values output over lives. Arthur hears about collapsed shafts, missing safety equipment, and wages that never quite match the danger. Overwork, unsafe conditions, and constant fear are not exceptions here. They are policy. Even the children bear the cost. Arthur's encounters in Annisburg are filled with small, devastating details. A boy begging for medicine he cannot afford, a girl already laboring, families half-starved in company housing. This is a generation that will be used up before the town ever thinks to call them its future. In the truest sense, they are heirs to wealth they will never see. Condemned to breathe dust so that distant investors can breathe easier. What happens when the coal runs out, or when a richer seam is found up the line? History suggests three paths, none of them kind. Annisburg might stagger on as a half-abandoned shell, a few families clinging to marginal jobs as the mine winds down. It might shrink into a modest river town, its grandest industry reduced to a memory, its slag heaps outlasting its businesses. Or a newer, more efficient operation could rise elsewhere, leaving Annisburg behind as a scar on the landscape, a cautionary tale rusting by the tracks. In that sense, Annisburg is a story of progress turned inward, of dreams and delusions that no outlaw gang ever needed to touch. The town is doing to its own people what Pinkertons and posses do to outlaws, hunting them, cornering them, grinding them down. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but in places like this, the new world is not a shining city. It is a hole in the ground. And Annisburg is not alone. If the most productive towns on the map are also the most doomed. What does that say about the next boomtown rising just over the horizon? If Annisburg is a mine that will one day fill with water and silence, then Van Horn is something even more fragile, a town that could vanish without anyone noticing it was gone. From its humble beginnings as a rough river landing, it never became a real hub, never turned its muddy shoreline into lasting power or influence. Towns like this existed all across the frontier. A dock thrown up on a bend of the river, a few shacks, a saloon, a general store that sold more whiskey than flour. When the railroads came through elsewhere, when proper ports rose in Saint Denis, or when Blackwater's investors built deeper piers and cleaner streets, places like Van Horn simply stopped mattering. The story of such settlements is a story of being bypassed, of trade routes shifting and leaving only driftwood behind. Walk through Van Horn and the decline is already carved into the wood and brick. Boarded-up buildings lean toward the water as if trying to throw themselves in. The hotel is barely functioning, the doctor's office feels temporary, and the only reliable service is the bar, where reliability means a steady supply of rotgut and violence. This is, in the truest sense, a town that has given up on the idea of a future. Its people reflect that surrender. The population is a rotating cast of drifters, alcoholics, and petty criminals, men and women whose dreams have already failed elsewhere. There is no strong ranching interest, no mine, no factory, no courthouse, no church with a spire pointing towards some higher purpose. No one here talks about building a family, buying land, or staying long enough to see children grow. Loyalty is measured by who shares a bottle, not by who invests in the town's survival. Without industry or strategy, Van Horn has no leverage with the state. St. Denis is plugged into national networks of capital and governance, the living embodiment of modern civilization with its streetcars, telegraphs, and political machines. Blackwater has respectable investors, a railroad, and a philosophy of order that the government is eager to protect. Van Horn has none of that. If it burned tomorrow, which senator would care? And fire is only one possible end. A major storm tearing in from the river could flatten half the waterfront in a single night. A crackdown by state authorities, tired of the town's reputation as an outlaw refuge, could scatter the remaining residents. Or the final collapse could be quieter. One bartender leaving, one ferryman dying, one more lost soul deciding there is nothing here worth staying for. The old ways were dying, but Van Horn never truly belonged to the new world either. It hangs between eras, too ruined to develop, too small to save. In a few decades, it may exist only as a smudge on old maps and in half-remembered stories muttered in St. Denis bars, if anyone bothers to remember it at all. If Van Horn is a dying echo, the Great Plains are the sound of something new being hammered into shape. This is not the wilderness of legend, nor yet the fully tamed heartland. It is a story of fences creeping across open range, of surveyors' stakes marching in straight lines where bison once roamed in great dark waves. From its humble beginnings as grazing land and hunting ground, the region west of the heartlands has become a patchwork of ranches, tenant farms, and construction sites. Windmills rise beside creaking wind-blown trees. Telegraph poles cut hard angles against the sky. A lone cowhand might still drive cattle across a field, only to pause at a barbed wire fence that did not exist a season earlier. The world was changing, and the change is written into every plowed furrow and every no trespassing sign nailed to a fresh post. At the center of this transformation stands Blackwater. Clean streets, painted facades, brick and glass instead of warped boards and mud. Where Valentine drowns its problems in whiskey, and St. Denis hides its corruption behind grandeur, Blackwater presents itself as respectable from the very beginning. It is the administrative and commercial hub in the truest sense, the place where land becomes paper, and paper becomes power. Courthouses, banks, and government offices give the town its quiet, suffocating gravity. Deeds are filed, mortgages signed, liens enforced. A ranch that began as a rough claim staked by a desperate family becomes a numbered parcel in a ledger, collateral for a bank that might never have seen a horse. The outlaw dream of simply riding out and taking what the land offers is replaced by contracts, interest rates, and foreclosure, notices pinned to front doors. Freedom now comes with a payment schedule. This shift reshapes the cultural identity of the plains. Once, this edge of civilization promised adventure, danger, the chance to disappear. By 1899, the promise is different. Stability, inheritance, the hope that a son will farm the same fenced acres a father paid off over 30 years. It is a story of dreams and delusions, of families betting their futures on wheat prices and railroad timetables instead of 6 guns. Even outlaws feel the pull. John Marston's later homestead life is not an accident, but the logical outcome of this new philosophy. Yet the taming of this land rests on bones. Before mortgages, there were massacres. The Blackwater Massacre is the wound the town refuses to look at directly, the moment when law, capital, and the gun met on a ferry and tore the Vander Linde gang's illusion of control to shreds. Long before that, native peoples were pushed off these same plains by soldiers and speculators, their stories buried beneath tidy pastures and patriotic speeches. Official histories praise progress and order, the soil remembers something else. By the time of Red Dead Redemption, the frontier has not only closed on the map, it has been rebranded. The Great Plains and Blackwater become the living embodiment of a West that has traded open violence for polite amnesia, replacing the outlaw with the loan officer, the raid with the auction. But how long can a world built on forgotten blood pretend its hands are clean? But the map remembers something else as well. On its far western edge, past the polite amnesia of Blackwater and the Great Plains, stands a place that has already answered the question those towns are too afraid to ask. That place is Tumbleweed. Tumbleweed is what happens when the dream ends and no one bothers to wake the town up. Its abandoned buildings lean into the wind, their windows punched out, their doors hanging crooked. Creaking signs sway over empty porches, announcing saloons and stores that no longer serve anyone. Dust rolls down the main street in slow, restless waves. and every shutter that bangs in the breeze feels in the truest sense like a ghost knocking. If Van Horn is a town rotting in real time, Tumbleweed is that rot completed, cleaned out, and left on display. From its humble beginnings, the settlement was not meant to be a failure. Environmental clues in Red Dead Redemption tell a story of ambition and optimism. A full courthouse, a gallows that saw regular use, a church up on the hill, ranches scattered across the desert. This was once a county seat, a place where law, commerce, and faith tried to stake a claim in the desert. But the world was changing. When the railroads and major trade routes shifted toward Armadillo and beyond, Tumbleweed's proud little main street was bypassed in a single generation. The tracks went elsewhere, the mail went elsewhere, the money went elsewhere. What remained was a town suddenly stranded between freedom and civilization, no longer central to either. Merchants closed their doors, respectable families packed their wagons, and those who could leave did. Those who stayed had fewer choices, and the choices turned darker. Lore, wanted posters, and the layout of the town suggests that crime, corruption, and lawlessness did not just follow the decline, they accelerated it. The courthouse becomes a hollow monument, its authority mocked by the gangs who now haunt the outskirts. The sheriff's office stands empty, its cells holding only dust. In a grim echo of Van Horn's present, the only real business that thrives is the business of fear. When the last vestiges of order gave way to petty warlords and desperate outlaws, Tumbleweed crossed a line it could not come back from. Tumbleweed's fate exposes the vulnerabilities already seen across the map. Over-reliance on a single industry dooms Annisburg to slow suffocation when the coal runs thin. Political instability and family betrayal threaten to pull roads apart, even as it tries to reinvent itself. Van Horn survives only as a den for every lost soul pushed out by more respectable towns. Each settlement is one diverted rail line, one economic collapse, one corrupt sheriff away from joining Tumbleweed in the dust. In that sense, Tumbleweed is a ghostly mirror held up to every place the gang ever passed through, a story of what happens when the old ways were dying, and nothing coherent replaces them. Which of these towns will still be alive in 20 years? And if they endure, what will they have to become to survive in a world that no longer has room for them? Or for men like Dutch, Arthur, and John? The answer lies not in the ruins of the West, but in a town that burns instead of fades. That town is Armadillo, and its story is not one of gunfights and glory, but of wells, waste, and a sickness no revolver can kill. From its humble beginnings as a dusty relay on the edge of the desert, it grows into a modest but functioning frontier hub, only to be gutted in a few short years by a disease most people never see coming until it is far too late. In 1899, Armadillo in the truest sense is ordinary. A saloon with music and card games, a general store with steady traffic, a jail that actually holds criminals, a stagecoach stop that ties the town to the wider world. It is small, rough, but alive, the living embodiment of a place trying to balance freedom and civilization on a single, rickety main street. By 1911, that same street feels cursed. The piano is silent, windows are boarded, and the few residents who remain stagger through town coughing, delirious, or begging strangers to stay away. What happened in between is a story of progress outrunning its own foundations. Cholera thrives where water is dirty and waste is everywhere, spreading through contaminated wells, unwashed hands, and cramped, unsanitary rooms. Armadillo booms faster than its infrastructure can keep up. More travelers, more animals, more outhouses, but no real investment in sewers, clean pumps, or public health. The world was changing, but the pipes and drainage ditches beneath the town never did. The game shows the cost without a single cutscene lecture. NPCs collapse in the street, clutching their stomachs. A preacher rants about sin while clearly feverish himself. A doctor admits he is overwhelmed. His office crowded with the dying, his supplies exhausted. Just outside town, fresh graves spread across the sand, rough wooden markers jammed into the earth so close together they blur into a single mass of anonymous loss. Even the air feels different, heavy with flies and the sound of distant coughing. Yet the official story does not match the reality. Newspapers mention an outbreak but downplay its scale, framing it as an unfortunate episode that will surely pass. Rumors in the saloon hint that local authorities worried more about scaring off investment and travelers than about stopping the disease. A clerk mutters that closing the stage line would ruin the town. A lawman insists things are under control while standing within sight of a wagon piled with bodies. Is it denial, delusion, or deliberate betrayal of the people they claim to protect? There is a bleak irony here. Armadillo is not destroyed by bandits, by some legendary outlaw, or by a grand showdown between good and evil. It is undone by water, by waste, by an invisible enemy that cares nothing for railroads, telegraphs, or romantic dreams of the frontier. The old ways were dying, but the new systems meant to replace them were incomplete, corrupt, or simply absent. In Armadillo, civilization arrives half-built, and that gap between appearance and reality becomes a grave. If a town can vanish that quickly, what does that say about the future everyone is chasing? The answer lies in another settlement that tries to control its fate rather than succumb to it, even if that control comes at a terrible moral cost. Blackwater is that town. From its humble beginnings as a river landing to its polished streets and electric lights, it becomes the living embodiment of a new promise. Order can be engineered, chaos can be pushed to the horizon, and progress can be bought in brick, glass, and gunmetal. But just offshore, in the churning water and gunsmoke of a single night, that promise is baptized in blood. The Blackwater massacre is never seen directly, only reconstructed from fragments. A ferry loaded with cash and passengers, a plan to rob it before it leaves the harbor, Pinkertons waiting in the wings, Dutch's gang boards expecting a clean score and a quick escape. Instead, shots crack across the water, civilians fall screaming, and the deck becomes a killing ground. Lawmen on the docks and Pinkertons on the boats answer with overwhelming force, firing into the confusion until the line between outlaw and bystander disappears. In the chaos, the gang does what it always does when the world turns against it. It runs. Dutch, Arthur, Javier, and the others abandon the bodies, abandon the town, abandon even the idea that they are in control. They flee into the wilderness north of Blackwater toward Coulter and the blizzard, leaving behind a half-sunken ferry and a story no one can fully agree on. Blackwater's authorities do not share that uncertainty. In the newspapers, the massacre becomes a story of civilization defending itself against savagery. Headlines frame it as a triumph of law over murderous outlaws, a regrettable but necessary stand that proves the town's resolve. The dead civilians are martyrs to progress, the Pinkertons are guardians of order, and the whole disaster is blamed on criminal greed rather than on a plan that spiraled far beyond anyone's control. Walk the town's streets, and there is almost nothing to suggest that a floating graveyard lies just offshore. No memorial on the pier, no plaque at the ferry office, no official marker where the shooting started. New construction, fresh paint, and constant commerce cover the scars. Is this healing or erasure? In the truest sense, Blackwater chooses to remember its fear and forget its complicity. For the Van der Linde gang, the memory runs the other way. Around campfires and in Arthur's journal, the massacre is framed as betrayal, bad luck, Dutch's one great miscalculation in a world that was changing faster than his philosophy could keep up. Some insist the Pinkertons sprung a trap, others swear a member talked, and Dutch himself clings to the idea that he was forced, that civilization fired first. Their version is messy, human, full of doubt and quiet guilt. Blackwater's is clean, official, and final. Between those two stories lies the gap where most history lives. The town rises as a polished emblem of order, but that order rests on a narrative that strips away the gang's humanity, reducing lost soul and killer, dreamer and outlaw, to the same faceless enemy. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is filed away as a simple police report, so Blackwater can stand proud as the future, even as it helps bury the past it created. Blackwater stands polished and triumphant in 1911, but its clean streets cast a long shadow over the rest of the map. If this town is the living embodiment of the future, what happens to the rougher, poorer places that once fed its rise? To answer that, the story has to move back across the plains, tracing the aging of the world from its humble beginnings in 1899 to the harsher, quieter reality of 1911. Take Valentine. In 1899, it is mud, blood, and cattle. A town that smells of manure and cheap whiskey, held together by the rail line and the promise that beef will always bring money. Its economy is simple but fragile, balanced between ranchers, drovers, and the trains that haul their herds east. If the world stays hungry for beef, Valentine can stabilize, even prosper. If rail routes shift or larger stockyards open closer to cities, that same dependence becomes a noose. The town's future is a coin toss between modest security and slow suffocation. Rhodes faces an even more uncertain fate. By the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2, the Braithwaite and Gray plantations are already decaying monuments, clinging to a pre-war hierarchy that the rest of civilization has begun to abandon. When the feud erupts and both families are shattered, the town loses not just its power brokers, but its entire organizing philosophy. In the truest sense, Rhodes becomes a place waiting for a new story. Does a timber baron buy the land, turning fields into lumber camps? Does some northern investor arrive with rail money and a courthouse renovation, reshaping loyalty into contracts and wages? Or does the vacuum remain, leaving Rhodes a stagnant backwater where burned mansions rot on the horizon and the old ways were dying for nothing? Far to the west, Armadillo answers that question with tragedy. Between 1899 and 1911, it transforms from a dusty, marginal stop into a town consumed by cholera, its main street haunted by coughing survivors and boarded-up storefronts. Newspapers whisper about contaminated water and failed government responses. What was once a minor promise of freedom becomes a cautionary tale about how quickly a settlement can be written off when profit dries up and disease moves in. Blackwater, by contrast, surges ahead. New rail connections, busy telegraph wires, and the first hints of automobiles knit it into a national network, while places like Tumbleweed are bypassed and left to die. Each new line of track is a verdict. This town lives, that one withers. This is a story of progress and betrayal, of dreams of prosperity that leave entire communities behind. Across this temporal sweep, every settlement becomes a character with an arc, rising, peaking, and fading on a timeline that stretches beyond any one outlaw's life. And as the camera pulls back from these towns, another question waits on the horizon. What happens to the people who refuse to age with the map, who keep chasing the old frontier even when there is nowhere left to run? For the Van der Linde gang, the map is not just geography. It is a story of rising hope, creeping compromise, and final collapse, written in mud, brick, and smokestack. From its humble beginnings in the snowbound camp at Coulter, every move southward drags the gang through towns that quietly mirror what they are becoming. Valentine is the first mirror, a muddy cattle town, half-built and half-drunk, where fights spill from the saloon and lawmen shrug as long as business keeps moving. It is messy, flawed, but still full of possibility. A place where an idealistic outlaw might believe there is room for freedom between the cracks of civilization. The gang brawls, robs, and laughs there, and for a brief stretch the camp at Horseshoe Overlook feels almost like a functioning family. Dutch's philosophy still sounds convincing over whiskey and piano music, because the town itself has not yet decided what it wants to be. Strawberry offers a variation on that optimism. Its prim mayor dreams of turning a backwater into a tourist destination, building a little pocket of order out of wilderness. Dutch humiliates him and frees Micah from jail, twisting that civic dream into farce, yet the damage feels containable. Here, the gang's improvisation still works. Mistakes can be ridden away from. The world was changing, but it has not yet slammed its door. Then comes Rhodes and the slow, poisonous pull of entrenched power. The genteel storefronts and quiet streets hide a decaying plantation economy, a feud between Braithwaites and Grays, and a racial hierarchy written into every interaction. The gang steps into this structure imagining it can play both sides, profit, and vanish. Instead, Sean dies in the street, Jack is kidnapped, and Dutch is promised that they do not prey on the innocent collapses under the weight of burned fields and dead servants. The town exposes the gap between his rhetoric and his actions. Saint Denis widens that gap into a chasm. This is civilization in the truest sense and the ugliest sense. A mechanized port city where factories choke the sky, segregated trolleys rattle past mansions, and Angelo Bronta hosts Dutch in a garden while children drown in the canals. Dutch speaks of freedom while cutting deals with a crime lord who owns half the police. He romanticizes the outlaw life in a place that runs on ledgers, telegraphs, and elections rigged in back rooms. Dutch is a man of the old ways. The city is the living embodiment of the new. By the time the gang reaches Annisburg and Van Horn, the mirrors turn cruel. Annisburg is a company town of coughing miners and starving families, where corporate power has already won. Dutch preaches liberation there, but what does liberation mean against coal, railroads, and bought politicians? Van Horn, by contrast, is civilization after it has been left to rot, a port of drunks, smugglers, and human wreckage. Dutch promises safety while the gang hides in Beaver Hollow, a camp surrounded by sickness, paranoia, and betrayal. The landscape itself seems exhausted. The Wapiti Reservation completes this descent. Here, the gang's fantasies of resistance run headfirst into a people who have already lost their war against the state. Dutch's speeches about fighting back sound heroic in his own mind, but beside Rainsfall's quiet grief, they become delusions. No amount of gunfire can reverse treaties, rail surveys, and massacres buried in official reports. Track the gang's emotional arc across these settlements, and the map becomes a single tragic biography of Dutch, of his family of outlaws, and of a dying way of life. Each town is a chapter, each chapter a reminder that the frontier's last defenders are not shaping history. They are being written out of it, one main street at a time. Each of these towns is more than a backdrop. Each main street, each saloon, each factory yard is the living embodiment of an America tearing itself apart and stitching itself back together at the same time. Ride through them in order and the map stops being a playground. It becomes a story of a country waking up from its own myths. Valentine is the mythic frontier in miniature. From its humble beginnings as a cattle and rail stop, it clings to an older dream of freedom, open ranges, rough justice, and a sense that a man's word and a revolver can still settle most disputes. The saloon brawls, the muddy streets, the communal poker tables and shared bottles all hint at a world where everyone knows everyone. And everyone pretends the railroad office and the bank are not already in charge. Yet the tracks cut straight past the corrals, the auction yard answers to distant investors, and the law quietly serves ledgers more than locals. The old ways were dying. The residents just have not read the obituary yet. Further south, Rhodes turns that denial into something uglier. This is the Post. Civil War South in the truest sense. Genteel manners, rotting plantations, and a town council haunted by the memory of a slave-based empire that will never return. The Braithwaite and Gray feud is not just a family squabble. It is a story of a ruling class trapped between nostalgia and reality, between the dream of aristocracy and the hard fact of economic collapse. The clan rallies in the woods, the sharecroppers toil on land they will never own, and corrupt sheriffs look the other way. Reconstruction has technically ended, but its betrayals and half-measures linger in every whispered remark and every segregated space. St. Denis, by contrast, does not pretend to be old. It advertises itself as the future. This Gilded Age city fuses industrial wealth, political corruption, immigrant labor, and brutal inequality into one choking skyline of chimneys and church spires. Mansions in the Garden District host soirees under gaslight while children sleep on crates by the docks. Trolley cars rattle past segregated benches, and Mayor Lemieux trades favors with Angelo Bronta behind closed doors. Progress is the slogan, exploitation is the business model. Beyond the city, the fade drops. Annisburg is the exploited industrial hinterland, coal dust in every lung, families trapped by company scrip, a river poisoned to keep distant factories running. Van Horn is what happens when even that meager usefulness runs out, a discarded periphery of drifters, rusted hulls, and lost soul after lost soul drinking away the end of the line. Then there is Blackwater, polished and modern, the respectable face of a nation eager to forget how it got rich. Wide streets, clean storefronts, and a ferry line built on blood that official histories will never mention. Taken together, these places compress 3 decades of American history into a single ride. From the 1870s to the early 1900s, from cattle towns to company towns, from plantation ruins to electric street lamps, the world was changing faster than any outlaw philosophy could adapt. The Van der Linde gang moves through this miniature America as both symptom and casualty, railing against civilization while robbing the very engines that drive it, dreaming of freedom while depending on the systems they claim to despise. How could such a gang survive in a country that no longer has room for its own legends? The answer lies in what happens when those legends collide head-on with the men who now own the future. Those men who own the future do not just build railroads and banks, they build worlds. In Red Dead Redemption 2, every town is a story of that ownership written in brick, timber, rust, and rot, long before a single line of dialogue is spoken. From the very beginning, the map itself becomes the living embodiment of a changing America. St. Denis rises out of the mist with brick facades, wrought iron balconies, and stone courthouses, a city that can afford to make permanence its philosophy. Valentine, by contrast, is all rough wood and exposed beams. A boomtown hammered together in a hurry, still smelling of sawdust and spilled whiskey. Ride east to Van Horn and the illusion collapses completely. Decaying plaster, leaning shacks, and half-collapsed warehouses tell a story of investment withdrawn, of a port town the world was changing past and leaving behind. Architecture becomes a census of power. Brick and gaslight signal old money and entrenched interests. Warped planks and mud streets hint at idealistic dreams of prosperity that never quite arrived. Even the peeling paint in Strawberry, with its half-finished civic pride, whispers about a mayor who wants civilization but cannot quite pay for it. No exposition is needed, the walls are already talking. Sound finishes what the skyline begins. In St. Denis, the clatter of streetcars, the hiss of steam, and the constant bark of factory whistles form a mechanical choir, drowning out the river and the birds. Freedom there is measured in schedules and timetables. In Valentine, distant train whistles and the slam of saloon doors dominate, a frontier rhythm caught between pasture and platform. Then there is Armadillo, the cough of the sick, the buzz of flies, the heavy, unnatural silence between them. Every missing piano tune and shuttered storefront makes the cholera outbreak feel in the truest sense like a curse on a dying dream. Inside these spaces, small details betray the cost. Emerald Ranch's family photos turn just off-center, hint at absence and betrayal more effectively than any cutscene. In the cramped shacks of Annisburg, children's toys lie beside coal dust and empty plates, a quiet ledger of lives mortgaged to the mine. In Butcher Creek, crude religious symbols nailed to doors and trees show a lost soul of a community clinging to superstition as the old ways were dying around them. These places do not stay frozen. New posters appear over old ones, promising rail expansions or draft notices. Windows that once glowed with lamplight become boarded over after key missions. NPC routines shift, a shopkeeper vanishes, a foreman drinks earlier in the day, a patrol route grows heavier. The main story rides on, but the towns keep accounting for what happened. Paying attention turns the map from backdrop into archive, from its humble beginnings as scenery into a living document of progress and decay. Every alley, every storefront, every abandoned yard becomes a footnote in the larger history unfolding around the gang. And if the land itself is keeping score, what happens when those silent records finally catch up to the people who tried to outrun them? Those silent records do not end with what the player can see. They extend into what almost existed, the ghost histories of the towns that never quite made it to daylight. In the truest sense, Red Dead Redemption 2 is also a story of absences, of streets and faces that were drafted, half-built, then quietly erased. From the very beginning of development, Blackwater was meant to be more than a distant wound. Early design work points to a larger playable section tied to the ferry robbery itself, with more time spent in its manicured streets and polished parlors before everything went to hell. Imagine walking past the very bank that will later be ringed with Pinkertons, hearing idle talk of new investment and riverboat schedules, feeling the town's confidence before the disaster brands it forever. That missing prologue would have deepened Blackwater's arc from shining frontier experiment to haunted no-go zone, the living embodiment of how civilization can turn on an outlaw family overnight. Rhodes carries similar ghosts. Cut and altered side stories hint at a longer simmer before the Braithwaite, gray feud boils over, with more small-town lives caught in the crossfire. There are unused interiors and quiet porches that seem built for shopkeepers, clerks, or minor politicians who never quite took the stage. Those blank spaces suggest an even richer tapestry of gossip, petty betrayals, and divided loyalties, turning Rhodes into a southern town choking on its own history, rather than merely a backdrop for the gang's brief occupation. Traces linger elsewhere. In St. Denis, files and layout choices hint at additional businesses and political encounters. More chances to see the city's corporate and municipal corruption working in tandem. Empty offices above the tram lines, sealed doors near the docks, and oddly detailed back alleys feel prepared for characters who would have embodied the merger between money and power. In Annisburg and Van Horn, unused shacks and half-finished interiors whisper of extra miners, smugglers, or union men, reinforcing the theme that the world was changing not just in grand speeches, but in every barroom argument over wages and freight. Speculation must stay tethered to evidence, but the pattern is clear. The removed missions and features lean toward three recurring themes: corporate takeover tightening its grip on Blackwater and St. Denis, political corruption ossifying in Rhodes and the Bayou, and community resilience flickering in the mining and river towns that refuse to die. Even in silence, these planned threads echo the gang's struggle between freedom and civilization, between idealistic dreams and the hard limits of capital and law. Paradoxically, what is missing makes the world feel larger: an unused storefront here, an oddly quiet corner there, and the player senses that each town has more history than the script can carry. Every gap invites imagination, turning cut content into negative space that still shapes the painting. It becomes a reminder that all histories, fictional or real, are curated, a story of what survives and of what is deliberately or accidentally forgotten. And if the towns themselves have lost soul fragments scattered in the margins, what does that say about the people trying to carve their names into them next? If the cut stories and abandoned designs are the bones of these towns, then player choice is the blood that starts to move through them. From the very beginning, the game quietly lets each settlement remember, turning every main street and muddy alley into a ledger of what Arthur Morgan has done there, and what kind of man he has chosen to be. Honor is the first ink on that page. In a high-honor life, Arthur rides into Valentine or Rhodes and is met with nods, warm greetings, and cautious respect, as if the town senses an outlaw trying to live by some rough philosophy of decency. Men tip their hats, women thank him for small kindnesses, children stare in awe rather than terror. In a low-honor descent, the same faces harden. Voices drop to whispers and slurs. Doors close. The exact same street becomes a story of suspicion, fear, and anticipated betrayal. Those shifting reactions are not just flavor, they are the living embodiment of a reputation system that ties morality to geography. A drunk in St. Denis might praise Arthur as a good fella in one playthrough and spit at his boots in another. A shopkeeper in Strawberry may offer a discount to the man who helped the sheriff, then flinch when that same silhouette belongs to a butcher who left bodies in the creek. The world was changing, but in these small exchanges it still remembers, and it judges. Then come the crimes that are too loud to forget. Rob a train near Valentine, shoot up the saloon in Rhodes, or gun down lawmen in Annisburg, and the town answers with wanted posters nailed to posts and walls, with bounty notices in the post office, with patrols that grow thicker every time Arthur dares return. The bounty system turns personal history into something visible and tangible. The player's past is literally plastered over the architecture, a paper trail of sin fluttering in the wind. Time makes that history sting. Leave St. Denis after the bank heist and return months later, and the city feels colder. Lawmen linger a second too long when Arthur passes. Some clerks refuse service outright, as if civilization itself is pushing the gang to the margins. In Van Horn or Valentine, a barkeep might remember a bar fight from hours of gameplay ago and mutter a warning under his breath. Who is being hunted here? The outlaw or his own legend? In the truest sense, each town becomes a moral mirror, reflecting not only Dutch's grand delusions and the gang's canonical spiral, but the specific choices layered on top of that script. From its humble beginnings as a neutral backdrop, every settlement is gradually carved into a personal archive of mercy shown, witnesses spared, hostages taken, and innocence trampled underhoof. Two players can stand in the same dusty street and inhabit completely different histories. By the time the credits near, no two maps bear the same scars. Some towns are havens, others are war zones, others are places Arthur can never safely enter again. And yet, beneath those divergent paths, the same question waits in the next settlement, in the next set of watchful eyes. What happens when the land itself starts keeping score more harshly than the law ever could? By 1911, the land has answered that question. The score has been tallied. Yet the memory of the Van der Linde gang lingers in the towns they once haunted, not as a clear record, but as a fog of rumor, fear, and half-remembered names drifting through a world that has moved on. In Blackwater, the story is already hardening into legend. The ferry disaster becomes local folklore, a cautionary tale told from the safety of paved streets and electric lights. Some call Dutch and his people the living embodiment of frontier savagery, the last great outlaws who dared to challenge civilization and paid the price in blood. Others remember only headlines and whispers, blaming that gang for every unsolved robbery or missing person. Blackwater prospers, the oil money flows, the banks grow fatter. The scars are financial and political, not physical, and for most residents, the gang is a story of the very beginning of the town's modern age, not its present reality. Further west, the past is harder to ignore. Armadillo, once a dusty but functioning stop on the edge of the desert, now chokes under cholera. The streets are empty, the undertaker is overworked, and the air smells of disinfectant and despair. Here, the Van der Linde gang is almost irrelevant. The disease does not care about Dutch's philosophy, Arthur's loyalty, or John's dreams of freedom. New horrors have replaced old legends. If anyone remembers the gang at all, it is as a name in an old newspaper, a ghost overshadowed by a more immediate plague. Tumbleweed tells a different story. The town has become a ruin in slow motion, its main street half abandoned, its church a lonely silhouette on the hill. The railroad bypassed it, the courthouse lost its authority, and civilization chose another route. In the truest sense, Tumbleweed looks like the gang's soul turned inside out. Abandoned ideals, empty promises. A place that bet on the old ways just as the old ways were dying. Here, the gang is not a monster under the bed, but a reminder that the entire frontier was temporary. Into these spaces walks John Marston, a man torn between past and present, between family and betrayal. He moves through Blackwater's polite streets and Armadillo's sickbeds as both outlaw and government hound, forced to hunt down the last remnants of his former family on behalf of the same forces that reshaped the map. Every town he enters is a verdict on Dutch's grand experiment. Was it ever more than delusion? Or was it always destined to be swallowed by railroads, corporations, and federal agents with ledgers instead of 6 shooters? The absences speak just as loudly. St. Denis, Rhodes, Annisburg, even Valentine do not appear on John's map in 1911. Did St. Denis drown under its own corruption, or simply become so thoroughly civilized that it no longer registers as frontier? Did Rhodes fade into a nameless southern sprawl once its feuding dynasties burned themselves out? Their trajectories in 1899 suggest both survival and erasure, prosperity and quiet decay. They remind the viewer that this is a story of many threads crossing, industrial empires, dying plantations, mining towns on the brink, and, woven through them, one doomed gang. In the end, the Van der Linde gang is neither the beginning nor the end of the West. It is one chapter in a larger book, a flare of violence and idealistic rhetoric that briefly illuminates the changing landscape before going out. The towns remember, but only in pieces. A rumor in a saloon, a warning to a child, a name scratched in a cell wall. The world was changing long before Dutch spoke of freedom, and it will keep changing long after John's last ride, as the next town, the next outlaw. The next dream rises to take their place. The towns remember in pieces, but together they tell a single, relentless story. A story of freedom narrowed into fences, of dreams paved over in brick and ballast, of the old ways dying under the weight of ledgers and law. From its humble beginnings in muddy Valentine to the choking dust of Armadillo, every settlement is a different angle on the same transformation. Valentine turns cattle and open range into cash and contracts. Rhodes launders a plantation war into gentlemen's politics. St. Denis is the living embodiment of industrial civilization, turning swamps into stockyards, human beings into labor, and rivers into shipping lanes. Even Annisburg and Van Horn, half rotten and half forgotten, show what happens when that same progress runs out of profit and simply leaves its workers to drown in smoke and whiskey. Against that backdrop, the Van der Linde gang is not just a band of outlaws. It is a philosophy on horseback. Dutch believes movement itself is freedom, that a camp can outrun any map. But each town they ride through is built on the opposite idea. Fixed property lines, courthouse records, bank vaults, telegraph wires, corporate offices. Mobility means nothing to a world that can track a name through Pinkerton files and railroad schedules. In the truest sense, their downfall is geographic as much as moral. Every time they circle back toward Blackwater, the site of the ferry disaster, the story tightens. Blackwater is clean, ordered, full of tourists and investors. It is the future that already won. Armadillo, rotting under cholera and corporate neglect, is the warning of what that future costs. One shines, one decays, but both prove the same point. There is no place left for an idealistic outlaw family that refuses to be bought or managed. The tragedy is not only that Arthur dies on a mountainside, or that John falls on a ranch he built with his own hands. The deeper wound is that the world they were running from, and running through, no longer needs them except as headlines and morality plays. Dutch becomes a column in a St. Denis newspaper. Hosea's gentleman thief philosophy is reduced to a cautionary tale for investors. The gang's last stand is used to justify more funding, more prisons, more control. Is there anything more ironic than an anti-establishment rebellion turned into a sales pitch for civilization? All the while, the game invites a kind of love. The sun over the heartlands, the fog in the bayou, the snow in the grizzlies. It is beautiful, almost sacred. Yet ride into town and the beauty curdles into exploitation. Children cough in Annisburg. Chain gangs dig ditches outside roads. Streetcars rattle past segregated benches in St. Denis. The frontier is gorgeous, but it is also a machine, grinding down land, animals, and people at the same steady pace. So what does it mean, after tracing every town's rise and ruin, to step back and look at the map one last time? Not as a playground of missions and robberies, but as a graveyard of dreams, of lost soul after lost soul nailed to a timetable and a title deed. The next section will linger on that final ride. When the gun is holstered, the horse slows, and the question becomes impossible to avoid. When the world was changing this completely, was the gang doomed from the very beginning? The answer, of course, is that doom was never just following the gang. It was built into the land, into every street and siding, every courthouse and cattle pen. From the very beginning, the game frames this world as a tug-of-war between freedom and civilization, between wilderness and industry, and every town on the map is a knot in that rope, pulled in both directions until it frays. Valentine sells itself as rough freedom, a mud-soaked cattle town where a man can drink, fight, and forget. Yet behind the swinging saloon doors stand auction blocks, railroad schedules, and men counting profit on the backs of ranch hands and drifters. Road pretends to be Gentile civilization, all white columns and manors, but its economy runs on a ruined plantation order, on moonshine, lynch mobs, and a family feud that treats human life as a ledger entry. St. Denis claims to be the future, the living embodiment of progress, with electric lights and streetcars, but its alleys are piled with garbage, its factories choke workers, and its politics are for sale to the highest bidder. None of these places are pure wilderness. None are pure industry. Each is a compromise, a scar where the old ways were dying and something harsher took their place. Annisburg's coal dust coats the river as thoroughly as it coats the miner's lungs. Van Horn is too lawless to be called civilization, yet too poisoned by trade and addiction to be called free. Even Strawberry, from its humble beginnings as a sleepy logging town, twists itself into a tourist trap under a vain mayor chasing modern respectability, hiding the stumps and the bodies behind fresh paint. Against this backdrop, the Vanderlinde gang is not an exception to the myth of the West. It is the mirror. Their story is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and broken on the wheel of progress. Dutch romanticizes the outlaw trail as resistance, as philosophy in motion, while the towns romanticize railroads, courts, and corporations as salvation. Both masks serve the same purpose, to hide the blood and grief underneath. Rockstar uses these settlements to pry at the classic Western narrative until it cracks. Who is called a hero when a Pinkerton guns down a fugitive in Valentine? Who is branded a criminal when a miner in Annisburg steals company coal just to keep his children alive? Who is quietly forgotten when cholera hollows out Armadillo and the headlines move on? The map becomes a ledger of names that never make the wanted posters. Look again at those streets and shorelines as an archive, not a playground. Every burned-out house near roads hints at a family erased. Every unmarked grave outside Blackwater whispers about the ferry job the town would rather remember as an unfortunate incident than a massacre. Riding through this world is, in the truest sense, an act of historical imagination. Filling in the gaps the game leaves open, deciding whose ghosts matter. And this archive does not end at the state line. When John rides through a decayed armadillo or a fading tumbleweed years later, the echoes of these earlier towns make every shootout, every creaking saloon door, part of a much larger, sadder song. The Red Dead universe becomes one long, broken chord, and in the next section, That chord will resolve on a single rider, a single road, and a horizon that refuses to stop receding. So the chord hangs in the air, unresolved, and the world of Red Dead narrows down to one last ride. Not a mission marker or a waypoint, but a slow, deliberate crossing of a map that has become, in the truest sense, a graveyard of dreams. It begins where the gang's second life began, in the white silence above Coulter. Hoofbeats sink into snow that once swallowed the gang's first desperate campfires, where frozen horses, dead O'Driscolls, and a wrecked train told a story of survival at any cost. From its humble beginnings in those blizzards, the road bends south, and the cold gives way to mud. Valentine appears with its sagging porches and manure-choked Main Street, a town that watched bare-knuckle brawls, drunken poker, and that first, almost innocent, bank robbery. The mud still remembers the day Kieran's severed head rolled out of the darkness, turning a rowdy cowtown into a stage for horror. The trail cuts east, past the tidy fences of Emerald Ranch, where a lonely house and a shuttered saloon whisper about a murdered daughter and a station master who turned grief into quiet cruelty. Further on, the road slips into Rhodes, its genteel facades still scorched by the night the Braithwaite Manor burned. The Braithwaite fire, the gray ambush, Sean dropping in the dust with a joke half-finished. Every plank of that main street feels complicit. Then the land flattens, the sky thickens with smoke, and Saint Denis rises ahead, the living embodiment of the new civilization. Factory whistles scream in the distance, echoing the night the Saint Denis Bank exploded into gunfire and chaos. Hosea's body on the steps, Lenny on the rooftop, Dutch's philosophy collapsing in a rain of bullets while the trolley bells kept ringing as if nothing had happened. The ride does not linger. It cannot. North now, into the gray choke of Annisburg, where coal dust hangs over widows waiting on broken porches, still framed by the memory of Arthur quietly handing over crumpled bills. Then east to Van Horn, a town that's drunk even when it is sober, its rotting docks and failed lighthouse watching over smugglers, deserters, and every lost soul the railroad forgot. The path turns south into the swamps. Past Lograss, where lanterns float over Blackwater and gators slide beneath skiffs. Past Butcher Creek, where superstition and disease twist into a single long nightmare. In the trees, it is easy to remember the cholera graves at Armadillo, the way an entire community can be reduced to warning posters and shallow mounds. Westward, the horizon opens and Blackwater's electric glow appears, the town that shattered the gang before the story even began. Beyond it, across the desert, lie Armadillo's boarded storefronts and Tumbleweed's wind-haunted gallows. Empty shells that prove the world was changing and the old ways were dying long before the last gunshot. From a distance, each town is small, just a cluster of roofs and roads. Up close, each one holds a story of freedom and betrayal, of family and abandonment, of idealistic dreams turning into brutal delusions. How many lives vanished under those signs, swallowed by railroads, corporations, epidemics, and progress that never asked permission? As the rider crests the final hill, the whole map lies behind, every town reduced to memory and dust. What remains is a choice. Treat these places as markers on a mini-map, or as fictional memorials to real histories that civilization prefers to forget. Because, in the next, and final, stretch of road, that choice will follow one rider toward a horizon that refuses to forgive. That horizon does not close the book. It opens the cover again. Because the story of these towns does not end when the credits roll, it only waits for the next rider who chooses to look more closely at what has always been there. The next journey through this world does not need to be a hail of gunfire and dead-eyed efficiency. It can be a walk, a slow, deliberate crossing of Valentine's muddy Main Street on foot, hearing the drunk outside the saloon complain about cattle prices, catching the half-heard insult about new money at the general store counter, reading the newspaper that quietly explains why the railroad barons care so much about this nowhere town. Every alley, every porch, every boarded window holds a fragment of a history run waiting to be reconstructed. From its humble beginnings as a backdrop for shootouts, each settlement can become the living embodiment of a different philosophy of progress. One return to Rhodes, taken at a walking pace, turns the old plantation houses into crime scenes from a story of betrayal and denial. Another measured circuit of Annisburg shacks and mine entrances reveals the cost of industrial freedom, as coughing miners and exhausted families sketch the outline of a community already sacrificed. A rider who once sprinted through St. Denis on a stolen horse can now linger on the segregated trams, the political posters, the whispered slurs in back alleys, and see a city that understands that the old ways were dying and intends to decide who replaces them. A new kind of playthrough can emerge, focused history runs. One camp might be dedicated entirely to Annisburg, following every side quest, every overheard argument, every letter in a miner's shack until the town's private archive feels complete. Another save might orbit Emerald Ranch, tracing its silent barns, its missing daughter, its suspiciously tidy bloodstains, until the place reads in the truest sense as a rural ghost story. Van Horn, with its ruined houses and half-sunk docks, becomes a study in what happens when civilization gives up, pretending it cares. No single lens can capture all of that. So the archive spreads outward, into conversations and shared theories. One observer might catch a line muttered in St. Denis about Bronte's friends up north. Another might notice a gravestone behind roads that reframes the Braithwaite Grey feud. Someone else might map the boarded storefronts that appear between 1899 and 1911, watching prosperity rot in real time. Each sharp eye adds to this collaborative chronicle, because this complete history has never claimed to be final. From the very beginning, it has been a story of fragments and perspectives, of loyalty to the text and suspicion of what the text refuses to say. Every lost soul found in a side alley, every ledger on a desk, every overheard confession becomes another line in a ledger that no single narrator controls. So the next time a horse slows at a dusty main street or a neon-lit city dock, the rider is not merely entering a mission zone. A threshold is being crossed into the last days of a world that never truly existed, yet explains so much about the one that did. Step down from the saddle, walk, listen, then return, and tell what the town's whispered.